The Decadent Date by Susan Hatler. Copyright 2025 by Susan Hatler. To my readers who believe second chances can lead to happily ever after. Chapter 1. Some people know at a young age what they want to do for a living when they grow up, but at 27 years old, I still didn't have a clue. I figured that part of discovering my passion meant I wouldn't know if a thing was my thing until I tried the thing out, right? Such logic was the reason this small beach town gal had once given scuba instructing a go. And okay, it was true that swimming, and being underwater in general, had never overly appealed to me. But people talked about scuba diving with such enthusiasm that it had made me excited that I might be missing out on something great. I mean, why wouldn't I want to feel like I'm on vacation all the time by teaching scuba diving in tropical waters? The darkness, the silence, the underwater creatures. Not to mention the crick in my neck from gaping around to make sure stealthy sea creatures weren't about to attack me from behind. Yeah, scuba diving had not been my thing. Nobody could accuse me of not putting enough effort into trying to find my thing, but I was starting to feel more than a little skeptical that I'd ever find my dream career. I'd already spent an entire year as a directionally challenged tour guide in the Rockies, a summer abroad bumbling the French language in a way that would have made my high school French teacher cringe, and several weeks last Christmas as a personal shopper who seemed to have a knack for picking out items people ended up returning. Although, why someone wouldn't want to keep 9 pleather reindeer who danced to La Bamba was beyond me. But whatever. My big sister Carrie told me I should just pick something, anything, those were her exact words, and stick with it longer without giving up so quickly. But it never took me much time to know when I didn't like something, and shouldn't expediency be a good thing? I thought so, but my sister seemed to think it was a crime to be fast at sizing things up. Of course, she had known at a young age that she wanted to be an artist, and had opened her own shop in our hometown of Blue Moon Bay in her early 20s, filling that store with her quirky and popular handmade trinkets. She'd recently opened a second shop here in Sacramento, where she had met the love of her life. Now, Carrie and Adrian were engaged, and I was happy for my sister, but at the same time her joy reminded me that I had fallen short, yet again. In fact, the last guy they first went out with spent the entire date complaining about each and every person at his work, a large company unfortunately, while I pondered my unfortunate dating choices. The sad fact was that I hadn't had a real connection with a guy since Spencer Black, my high school boyfriend and my one and only love. He'd broken my heart and then left town before I could get any real closure. I wanted to blame trust issues for never getting as close to anyone since, but the truth was I'd tried. Some of my boyfriends had been better than others, but I'd never felt that same spark again. Better to focus on work. I was now diligently and relentlessly searching for that elusive thing I would love to do for a living that could very well be interpretive dance instructor, which was the reason I dragged Carrie and our friend Courtney Carmichael to an interpretive dance class this afternoon. Please, oh please, let this be my answer to a fulfilling career. How many different jobs should one woman have to try out before she found one that fit? Sigh. Maybe I'd love this class and then train to be an instructor. Sure, I'd never danced much except once at my prom, alone, and well, more times than I wish to admit in my shower, also alone. But I'd recently read an article raging about how popular interpretive dance was becoming, so maybe this career possibility would finally, at long last, be my thing. I was probably obsessing over my life's choices right now, because the instructor of the class, a tall, lithe woman with dreadlocks wrapped atop her head in a colorful bandana, had told us to start thinking about our path in life, and my path felt more like a maze with dead ends. Think about your path in life and how it has brought you here to this moment. Just move the way your body wants to move, she'd said, in a soothing and serene tone that made me want to curl into a ball and take a nap. Your body is a vessel for this journey we call life. Your movements will help you become in sync with the universe, even if your conscious mind does not know how. Feel the flow. Feel the path. And just move. Feeling and moving, I said, ready to stop thinking about my past. Determined to give this dance class my very best effort, I fought to really let go, shaking my hips and accidentally knocking into Courtney, who staggered sideways and plowed into Carrie. I cringed, giving a wide-toothed smile. Oops. Courtney recovered her stance and gave me a look. If I need physical therapy after this class, Tabitha, that's on you. Sorry, I said, glad to see that Carrie had righted herself quickly. You okay? Carrie tilted her head to the side. Did I forget to turn off my flat iron? I shook my head. You always think that, and not once have you left it on. I'm just not sure. She threw her gaze to the ceiling while dancing a figure-8 move with her hips and holding her arms above her head, making her look relaxed and flowy. Of course, she'd picked up interpretive dance quickly. I, on the other hand, probably looked like a drowning frog. Maybe bringing Carrie and Courtney to this dance class had been a mistake. I was, after all, supposed to be the free-spirited one in our trio, with a hint of hippie and a pinch of adventurer thrown in for good measure. How did Courtney look more relaxed than me right now? She was an attorney, for goodness sake. Although, she'd given up that thriving career when her husband left her, saying she hadn't paid enough attention to him. Ouch. Now, Courtney was single and owned a coffee cart that was decked out in enough Hawaiian-themed trinkets to make you almost hear ocean waves crashing against the brick buildings in Midtown Sacramento. She'd been stressed out and working long hours as a lawyer, and now had a career that made her happy, which inspired me to believe that I'd find my perfect job too. In fact, maybe this was it. Thinking positively, I swung my arms, bounced from foot to foot, and twirled my skirt, hoping with every cell in my body that something would click. This is so freeing, I lied, in a fake-it-until-you-make-it effort to not give up quickly or I'd get another lecture from my darling sis. I love this type of dancing and how I can just let go. I scooped my hands toward the floor and then threw my fingers upward toward the ceiling, as if I were showering the dance studio with rose petals or autumn leaves. Carrie and Courtney turned to one another, raising their eyebrows. What? I asked, feeling breathless and trying to ignore the growing cramp in my side. This feeling the flow stuff was hard work. With a burst of energy, I skipped past some other dancers before returning, my movements wild and unpredictable. I saw Carrie and Courtney exchange another look, and I lifted my eyebrows hopefully. Do I look like I know what I'm doing? Hey, whatever you're feeling is fine. Courtney shuffled a little to the left and then to the right, which seemed to be a half-hearted attempt if you asked me, before coming back to a still position. Carrie marched forward with a few sturdy, confident steps, and then back to her spot, but she looked like her mind was elsewhere, probably on her flat iron. I could be good at dance, right? I asked with a forced smile. Your call, Courtney said with a shrug. I feel pretty steady with my path in life right now, so I'm thinking a treadmill might be more my style. You prefer a treadmill to dance? I asked. She laughed. We all have our own path. I turned to Carrie. Are you steady in your path? This isn't a competition, Tabitha, she said, avoiding my gaze as she ducked her head. Of course, she felt steady in her path right now, since like 2 seconds after she'd opened the Carrie's Kaleidoscope shop here in Sacramento, it started booming. Not to mention her relationship with Adrian was a perfect love story come true. How had my sister and Courtney found their paths and I hadn't? Was I doing something wrong? The instructor danced to the front of the room. All right, everyone, let's imagine what it would feel like to be a sunflower right now. Closing my eyes, I thrust my chest upward, imagining I was a sunflower. I pretended to be waking up and turning toward the sun, and that the ceiling was the sky. Staring at the wooden shiplap ceiling, I had to face reality. I was Tabitha Smith, not a sunflower. Why couldn't I be a sunflower like Carrie and Courtney and the rest of the class? There was no denying it, an interpretive dancer was not my thing. Maybe the disappointment of this realization made me a little distracted, or maybe my sunflower self just withered and died, because somehow I tripped over my own feet and ended up falling sideways toward the floor. Maybe Carrie had finally forgotten about her flat iron and had gotten a little more aggressive in her dance moves, and that was the reason she tripped over me and fell. And maybe Courtney really did need a treadmill because she tripped over my ankle, and the three of us ended up on the floor together in a pile of tangled limbs. And like a slow-motion movie after I'd fallen, I watched my cell phone bounce across the floor and hit the wall, landing on the wooden floor with a smack. Probably hadn't been the best idea to put that in my skirt pocket. A second later, I pushed myself up and winced, holding my surely bruised elbow as I sat upright. The class shot us sympathetic looks as the instructor walked toward us, and Carrie hauled me to my feet. I turned and found myself facing the instructor. "Finding the right path can be painful, but you'll get there," she said, her tone calm and knowing as she looked me in the eye. "Good work, everyone. See you next time." Finding the right path can be painful? Apparently she meant physically painful, because my arm was throbbing. I shook my head. Any lingering ideas about dancing my way to my thing were long gone at this point, and even Carrie's look seemed to agree. "Sorry, little sis, but you gave it a good try," she said, before she and Courtney went to get our gym bags on the other side of the room. With a sigh, I crawled across the floor on all fours toward the wall and picked up my phone. As I turned my cell over, it beeped with a voicemail. I glanced at the number as I stood, thinking it looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. Something tingled on the back of my brain. A local and familiar area code. Huh. As I checked my cell phone screen for cracks, we walked outside and Carrie examined my elbow as Courtney came over with a bag of shaved ice from her coffee stand just outside. "You okay, Tabitha?" she asked. My voice trailed off as the voicemail transcription came across the cell screen. I read the message once, twice, and then I sank to the sidewalk. "No, I'm not all right. Not at all." When I arrived at the law offices of Frank Fields and the receptionist escorted me into the conference room, I was surprised to find an older gentleman wearing a suit, leaning back in a chair reading a romance novel. The receptionist cleared her throat. "Mr. Fields?" "Huh? What?" the man said, seeming to have been lost in the book. "Tabitha Smith is here for the 10 o'clock meeting," she said, backing away. "Oh, hi there," he said, standing up to shake my hand as the receptionist left the room. "I'm Frank Fields." "Nice to meet you," I said, even though it wasn't a nice circumstance to be meeting him. Not in the slightest bit. "A pleasure to meet you as well," he said, giving me a nod before pulling his hand away. "Like we talked about on the phone, Mr. and Mrs. Black named you in their will. But we'll need to wait for their grandson, Spencer Black, to arrive before we begin." He'd told me this on the phone, but hearing Spencer's name again sent all sorts of mixed feelings coursing through me: curiosity, excitement, bitterness. "Should I take a seat?" I asked. "Please." He held his arm wide, gesturing to a leather chair. "Make yourself comfortable." "Thank you," I said, surprised to see him return to his seat, lean back in the chair and put his feet up on the edge of the table. He wore white sneakers with his trim, tidy black suit. That seemed kind of interesting. It was also interesting that his coffee cup was Twilight-themed, stating Team Jacob. But it was not interesting or surprising that Spencer Black had not arrived on time. Nor was it shocking that 45 minutes later, he was still Mia. "Would you mind calling him again?" I asked, glancing at the clock as I paced back and forth across the rug, knowing it was no use. It didn't matter if it was 45 minutes, 4 hours, or a whole day. I doubted Spencer would show up. "Let's give him a few more minutes," Mr. Fields said, keeping his eyes glued to the words in his book as he turned the page and continued reading as if enthralled. I rolled my eyes. Waiting even one more minute for Spencer Black would be a waste of time. Spencer hadn't been at his grandparents' funeral either. I had been surprised by that, though. When he decided to leave town at 17, I figured I'd never see him again. Even though his grandparents had lived across the street from my grandparents, I had stopped spending summers with my grandparents. Just busy with my adult life and many jobs. Never once had I imagined having to lay flowers on their side-by-side graves and never seeing them again. And I certainly had never considered that I would be standing in their attorney's office, awaiting the reading of their will, while their attorney read Falling for my French instructor. I shook my head, thinking that Spencer should have attended his grandparents' funeral. And he didn't. Just like he wasn't here in this office. Just like he hadn't given me a real explanation 10 years ago as to why our love hadn't been enough to keep him from leaving. "Perhaps you haven't noticed, Miss Smith," Mr. Fields said without glancing up from the pages of his book, "but there are two perfectly nice chairs in front of you in which you are more than welcome to sit." Mid-pacing, I glanced at the two perfectly nice chairs and quickly dismissed them. I had too much energy running through my veins to sit right now, so I resumed my back-and-forth movement without comment. Frank Fields raised an eyebrow over the rim of his reading glasses as he stared at me. I gestured to an overflowing file on the edge of the table. "What are those?" I asked. He opened the folder and scanned the first of many crinkled pieces of torn notebook paper that I recognized immediately. My heart skipped a beat. "Let me see those," I said, my stomach tightening. "I'm sorry," he said, closing the file and returning to his book. "But you'll have to wait for the reading of the will." "And we have to wait for Spencer Black to be here in order to read it?" I asked. I got only a curt nod in response. And just like that, I knew I was doomed to seemingly endless inner turmoil. See, it wasn't like I was eager to read all of those letters. No, I knew each and every one of them by heart. Instead, I was eager to get my hands on them so I could torch them and watch them go up in flames. And that was why I couldn't sit in those perfectly nice chairs, and why I had to bother Mr. Fields with my loud steps, and why I kept glancing at the clock even though time didn't seem to be moving, not since I'd just learned that the file contained Spencer's old love letters to me. Love letters I had left on his grandparents' front steps should he ever return, which he hadn't. Love letters that were, each and every one of them, stained with my tears. "Alrighty then," Mr. Fields said, closing the book and setting it on the table. "I think it's best we get started." I crossed my arms. "Why now?" Mr. Fields gave me a patient smile. "Finish the chapter. Please take a seat." "I'll stand," I said, thinking Falling for my French instructor must be a particularly engrossing book that I might have to check out from the local library. "But thanks for the offer." He gave me a look as if he were slightly annoyed. "Yeah, join the club, dude," but he raised his shoulders in a gesture of "whatever you want," before tidying some papers in front of him and clearing his throat. "You're really going to read the will without Spencer Black present?" I asked, wishing I didn't feel guilty about that fact. After all, he was the one who had chosen not to show up. But still, these were his grandparents, the lovely people who had raised him. He must be hurting so much. Not my problem, I reminded myself. Unfortunately, the guilt did not abate. "I'll contact Mr. Black with an update when we are finished," he said. "You know where he is?" I asked a little too quickly. Mr. Fields assessed me studiously from over the top of his glasses. "Your relationship with Mr. Black is platonic," I said, though that wasn't really true. We weren't close anymore, and the feelings I had for him bordered on hostile. "Complicated," I amended, my cheeks heating under Mr. Fields' steady gaze. "Estranged," I said, thinking that word felt too generous. I hadn't spoken to him since that night, and I didn't want to speak with him ever again. "I knew him, okay?" I said lamely. "A long time ago. But that's over now. Long over, I said, wondering how much my babbling was revealing about my previously broken heart. Nice, Tabitha. Why didn't I just give him my shrink's number? Look, can we just get on with it? Mr. Fields nodded like this option was satisfactory to him. A part of me wished I could have been able to better describe what Spencer and I had once been to each other. It hadn't always been like this. But how was I to convey the enormity of those summers with him? How was I supposed to explain that I had thought Spencer was my forever love until he was forever gone? How could I express the thrill of riding on Spencer's motorcycle? Or the excitement of hearing the pebbles he'd toss against my window? Or the certainty I'd felt, knowing he ran away from most people, but he would never run away from me? And how I'd been so terribly wrong? Maybe Spencer's love letters might have a suitable line or two that would explain the intensity and closeness of our past relationship. But that was why they had to burn. Not that Spencer and my former relationship was any of this man's business. Shoot, he was probably getting paid by the hour from the estate for reading Falling for my French instructor. All right, Miss Smith, Mr. Fields said, reaching into the file and pulling out an envelope. This will be quite simple. I've been instructed to give you this note, which is from Mr. and Mrs. Black. A note? I asked, my eyes watering as I held out my hand and accepted the little cream-colored envelope with my name typed on the front. And? Mr. Fields shuffled through his papers and procured one. Ah, yes. And this? Biting my lip, I accepted that paper too. I looked down at the document, my eyes scanning every word. What the? And the only stipulation is that you can't sell the restaurant for at least 3 months, he said, clicking open a pen and setting it in front of me. Now, I need you to sign here and… I'm sorry, I said, tucking my chin to my chest. Did I read this correctly? Did the Blacks leave me a restaurant in their will? Yes, indeed. Mr. Fields placed a finger to a line on the document and then lowered his glasses to read, The Decadent Diner. But I can't sell for 3 months, that's correct. A slight inconvenience to receiving your inheritance, I'm sure. But the will was quite clear on that matter. A restaurant, I thought. A restaurant given to me. I'd been running to the ends of the earth and back, trying to hunt down my thing. Could it really be that after all this time pursuing various jobs, the right career might have just fallen into my lap? I saw a million opportunities flash before my eyes. I could cook. I could bake. I could serve. I could manage. I could stock the old-timey soda bottles. I could write invoices. I could decorate. One of those just had to be my thing. The Blacks knew me better than anyone besides my own family, and in many ways they were family. Scrabble nights. Drive-in movies until Spencer got caught stealing me a box of Whoppers. Sunday roasts together where Spencer, with a black eye from school and a pack of frozen peas to his elbow, always managed to snap the wishbone in my favor. Spencer had a way of invading my memories, but the point was that the Blacks wouldn't have left me the Decadent Diner if they didn't believe there was something in it for me. So I was excited. I was finally on my way. I was? Mr. Fields said, as I went to grab the file folder of love letters on my way out. I raised an eyebrow. But those aren't for you, Miss Smith. I felt slightly indignant, even though this was exactly what I had wanted, to not be anywhere near those cursed things. I laughed a little, since he must be joking. Who could they be for if not me? They were written to me. Mr. Fields consulted his notes once more. These are intended for Mr. Spencer Black. If I could go back and change time, I would make myself not return those letters. Mr. and Mrs. Black had been kind in leaving me a restaurant, but giving Spencer back those letters? What in the world had they been thinking? Actually, I had a feeling I didn't want to know the answer. Chapter 2. After an emotionally exhausting day, I put on my comfiest pajamas that I had sewn myself when fashion designer had been on the table. That career hadn't worked out since all I wanted to make were pajamas, exclusively with jumping sheep. The death of Spencer's grandparents brought memories of my time with them to the forefront of my brain, including memories of my relationship with Spencer and, most especially, the demise of our love. My chest went hollow as the thoughts circled inside my head. To try to calm my racing mind, I spritzed my pillow with a lavender spray. When that did nothing to help me relax, I put on the lullaby I had recorded when I'd pondered being a voice actress. I'd used my friend's recording studio to create going-to-sleep songs, but it turned out my voice wasn't all that calming, according to my sister and friends. At least this was a failed attempt that had left me with some products I kind of liked. With a deep breath filled with lavender scent, I closed my eyes and listened to the lullaby of soothing words mixed with relaxing piano music. My eyes opened again. Nope, this wasn't working. I kept thinking about Mr. and Mrs. Black and how they had really and truly left me a restaurant in their will. A restaurant. Who would leave a restaurant to someone they hadn't seen in a decade? Okay, I was touched. They had been like family to me while I was growing up. I closed my eyes, my heart warming as I remembered all of the good times I'd had at their house and with them at my grandparents' house. My forehead wrinkled as I realized sleep wasn't going to happen anytime soon. My eyes popped open again. Before I knew it, I jumped out of bed, snatched my keys, darted outside onto the quiet street where my car was parked, and hopped into the driver's seat. I pulled out of the parking space beneath the canopy of street lamp-lit tree branches, pondering if running the inherited restaurant could be my elusive thing. I zoomed down the street, knowing I had to find out the answer and there was no time to waste. When I pulled into the empty parking lot at the Gold Rush Shopping Center, it was obvious this charming area had seen better days. Some of the storefronts were empty, and for rent signs sat in those windows, faded from the Sacramento sun. But that didn't stop my pulse from racing. Could running a restaurant be the thing I'd been searching for all this time? Only one way to find out. Putting my foot to the pedal, I drove past the shopping center, feeling more than a little curious about this restaurant I'd inherited. Sure, this area seemed to have gone downhill. But Mr. and Mrs. Black's restaurant could be a diamond in the rough, which still made it a precious gem. Oh, there was a cute little sign for Gold Rush flowers next door to the restaurant, and the flower shop had a storefront covered in luscious ivy and potted plants practically dripping with jewel-toned flowers. I once worked as a wedding planner's assistant, and I didn't want to think about how many flower arrangements I'd messed up before ending that career path. Maybe all of those attempts had led me here. I had my pick of parking spots, given there was only one other car parked here. So I pulled up right in front of the restaurant, my headlights shining against the front door. The leather of the old-timey booths seemed to sparkle under the beam of my headlights. I imagined the gleaming jukebox just out of sight. I could practically see myself wearing a frilly apron and maybe a hairnet over a beehive-styled hairdo, while holding a pot of freshly brewed coffee. I'd wear cat-winged glasses to complete the look. And I didn't even need glasses to see. The engine of my old car sputtered before it died. Then I got out and hurried to the front door, inserting the key into the lock. I paused after turning the key, sucking in a deep breath, squeezing my eyes shut, and standing still for a moment, focused like Carrie and Courtney had been at the dance class, assured, confident, and at peace. I pushed the door open and was fumbling for a light switch when I heard a noise coming from the back, a sort of rustling sound. My first thought, raccoons. My 6 weeks as a camp counselor in the backwoods of Colorado had ensured that I would always think of raccoons first when hearing scratchy noises. Shudder. I tiptoed into the kitchen and grabbed hold of a cast-iron frying pan that almost slipped right out of my grip due to the handle being super greasy. My theory of a raccoon invasion seemed to be strengthened by the fact that the noise was coming from the storeroom and pantry at the very back of the kitchen. Those vermin. Those sneaky, hungry vermin. From my experience at camp, I knew they would only leave after they ate through everything. They were elusive, clever, and honestly, kind of cute. But that was not the point. If there was a raccoon in there, it was going to come face to face with the wrath of my frying pan, which I'd use to shoo it outside. No one was going to come between me and my thing, especially not a furry little. Gotcha, I said, swinging the door open and lifting the frying pan high to surprise the mask-faced pest. My gaze connected to the man in front of me, who wasn't a little pest at all. The guy in front of me was tall, with a broad chest and green eyes like his grandpa. My mouth dropped open, my arm remaining frozen in the air with that frying pan. Standing in front of me was Spencer Black. My stomach tightened and my pulse raced. Spencer's eyes widened as he stared down at me, a haphazardly made turkey sandwich in his hand. He looked me up and down, before the corner of his mouth curved upward. "Cute pajamas, Tabs," he said, using a casual tone that sounded as if an entire decade hadn't passed since the last time we'd seen each other. "Wabaha," I said, shifting my feet. He gave me an odd look. "Want a milkshake?" No," I said, stunned to find him here, especially at this late hour. He moved past me and flipped on the light in the kitchen as I followed. He started moving around and gathering items, including milk and chocolate powder. I dreamed of seeing Spencer Black again, and most of those scenarios included passing him on a city street where bus tires ran over a muddy puddle at high speed, splashing him big time like he deserved. But I'd only imagined him as that lanky 17-year-old I'd been madly in love with. This was no lanky man in front of me. Spencer had grown taller, with muscles that filled out the leather jacket he wore, which looked like the one he used to borrow from his grandfather's closet. Instead of his short, dark hair being combed back, it looked a little too long and fell across his forehead in a messy way. A 5 o'clock shadow covered his jawline with a small scar I didn't remember. He smelled like spicy cologne and looked extremely sexy. Not fair at all. "It's good to see you," he said. "I wish I could say the same," I said, protecting my heart with thick armor. "Why no milkshake?" "You love milkshakes," he said, glancing at me over his broad shoulder, his voice deeper than before. "Cherries still your fave?" He was talking to me like we were friends, like we were close, like we were in his grandparents' kitchen hanging out like we used to do. We used to whisper because they were asleep, and we were supposed to be too. The fact that he remembered how much I loved cherries made my heart flutter. And that was reason enough to raise the frying pan once more. "I loathe cherries," I lied, not wanting him to get a single thing right when it came to my happiness. The guy had broken all of his forever love promises to me, and didn't deserve to think he had a clue as to how to make me happy, even if it was only with, a milkshake. He gave me an expression that I couldn't read, and then added frozen cherries into the blender anyway. My mouth started watering. "What are you doing here, Spencer?" I asked, gesturing with the frying pan. "What am I doing in my own restaurant?" "That's a strange question." I laughed. "Your restaurant?" "Ha." Spencer looked genuinely surprised by my response. He also eyed the frying pan a little warily. "Who exactly did you think your co-owner was?" he asked. Clearly, I was hearing things. "I'm sorry, did you say co-owner? Didn't Mr. Fields explain the terms to you?" he asked, a little crooked grin appearing. "Of course," I said, waiting for the punchline. Okay, I hadn't been able to stomach reading the entire paper Mr. Fields had given me that pertained to the will. Too upsetting. He said I inherited this restaurant and can't sell it for 3 months. "We can't sell it for 3 months," he said, and then turned the blender on. The whirring sound of the blender echoed throughout the kitchen as my entire body went numb. I set the frying pan down on the counter. The will stated that I owned this restaurant with Spencer. No, 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 I said, holding my palms up. That can't be correct. Everything was falling apart. My thing was turning into a complete and total nightmare. My vision blurred for a moment, and my head spun. I wasn't aware of anything but how horrible this situation had become until Spencer turned off the blender, poured the creamy liquid into a glass, and held it out to me. Not one to waste food, I took the milkshake and knocked some back in several long gulps. Oh wow, delicious. Although it did nothing to make me feel better about what I'd just learned. Spencer and I co-owned this restaurant together. Nothing could be worse than this news. We should go out to dinner, he said. And the evening just got worse. Not if my life depended on it. My eyes flared at the horrifying thought of ever letting Spencer near my heart again. If you think I have any interest in dating you, Spencer, you are sorely mistaken. Dating you is the last thing in the world I would ever want to do. I refuse. I refuse to even entertain the thought. Instead of being upset at my clear and unmistakable rejection, he grinned. I meant we should have a business dinner to assess the situation we've got on our hands, Tabs. My cheeks heated. Oh. I figured dinner here tomorrow evening would be a good time to hammer out the details, since we're business partners now. I curled my lip. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. But that statement was very presumptuous of you. I absently wrapped my hand around the handle of the frying pan. Promise me that this is only about business and you don't, in any way, think of having dinner with me as a date. It's not a date. You can release the frying pan. I hesitated. Maybe I'll bring this along tomorrow night. Just in case. Spencer shook a whipped cream bottle and then spurted a mound of fluffy cream atop his milkshake. So it's a date then? He asked, his green eyes sparkling. We'll square away business, but that's all, I said, hating how my belly did flip-flops when he looked at me like that. He really did have the most beautiful eyes. Good night, Spencer. See you tomorrow, Tabs, he said. The frying pan rattled against the counter as I dropped it. I could hear the echo of Spencer's laughter as I walked away, and those green eyes haunted my mind the rest of the night. Chapter 3. The next day, I told Carrie about my upcoming dinner with Spencer, and she told me that I should be willing to hear him out, adding that she and Adrian certainly didn't get off on the right foot, but eventually found their way back to one another. Courtney told me that she knew better than anyone what a second chance could do for a person, and that I might be surprised to discover that Spencer had changed into a new man. What kind of garbage advice were they giving me? They seemed to think I was still interested in Spencer, when I so wasn't interested in him in the slightest. They claimed there seemed to be something unresolved between us, but there wasn't. All was resolved and done 1,000 times over. Tonight was merely a business dinner, one that I didn't even want to attend. In hindsight, I probably shouldn't have admitted to them how hot Spencer had looked. But they had asked the question, and should I have lied? I mean, I had eyes. There was nothing wrong with saying the guy was attractive. Did that mean I wanted to rekindle anything with him? No, it absolutely did not. He'd broken my heart. I didn't want a single thing from that man, except for him to sign over his share of the restaurant to me, and then leave, like he was already exceptional at doing. This would be my only goal in going to dinner with him, despite Carrie's insistence on doing my hair and makeup, which shouldn't matter to a temporary and very reluctant business relationship. No matter what Carrie and Courtney thought, there was nothing going on between Spencer and me, and there never would be. End of story. So it was quite a shock when I pulled up in front of the restaurant that evening and saw Spencer going into Gold Rush Flowers next door. And it wasn't him going into a florist that surprised me, but that he was wearing a suit. And he held a card. Flowers, a suit, and a card. What the? He'd better not have any ideas other than severing our business partnership after the mandatory 3 months, or sooner. Not with me. Not ever. Nope, nope, and nope. I was so frustrated at what he was clearly doing that I forgot to put the car in park, so the car started rolling as soon as I stepped out. Yikes. Get a grip, Tabitha. Park the car, get your keys, and do not think about Spencer Black. As if on cue, those green eyes appeared in my mind, and I suddenly remembered him closing those beautiful eyes over a decade ago for our first kiss in his grandparents' backyard. So soft and sweet. Stop. I shook my head. Jumping out of the car to put an end to any more depressing replays, I slammed the car door shut too quickly and caught my dress in the door. Then I dropped my keys beneath the undercarriage, bent over to pick them up, and accidentally hit the back of my head on the side view mirror as I straightened. I felt flustered, my cheeks were hot, and my breathing heaved from frustration. Arg. This madness had to end. With that laser-focused thought in mind, I stormed into the florist's shop and inhaled a sweet aroma that under any other circumstance would have made me smile. Looking around the shop, I spotted Spencer leaning casually against the counter at the back, his tanned fingers twisting a single rose around in a vase. He was speaking to a woman who was cutting stalks and smiling at him while they chatted. I hurried past the baby's breath and tulips and violets and roses, each flower looking more beautiful than the last, before I stopped in front of Spencer. I poked him on the shoulder. You promised this would not be a date, I blurted. This drew the attention of both Spencer and the woman behind the counter. I pushed some flyaway hairs from my sweaty forehead and glared at Spencer, who grinned back at me. Hey Tabs, he said, his green eyes dancing. You do something different with your hair? Privately thrilled he'd noticed my curls, I gestured at his suit, which I didn't want to admit looked really good on him. You're wearing a suit. That looks like date attire. The woman's eyes widened at my clipped tone, but Spencer remained cool, calm, and collected as if he were enjoying himself. I pointed at the paper in his hand. That is a card and those are flowers. Both are appropriate for a date. The woman opened her mouth, but I held up a finger. If you'll give me just a moment, I said, moving closer to Spencer. I get that we unfortunately received an inheritance together. But our relationship didn't end well, to say the least, and I do not want to date you now or ever. I moved on a long time ago. A line formed between his eyebrows. You're seeing someone now? Well, no, I said, curling my upper lip. But that's not the point. His wrinkle smoothed. Look, Tabs. You might think old wounds can heal, Spencer, but I'm not willing to dredge anything up no matter how many roses you give me. Those are very pretty, by the way, but that's incidental. I feel like I've made myself clear. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Perfectly, he said, as if what I'd told him was very reasonable. Then he gestured to the woman next to him. Tabitha, this is Katie. She's the owner of Gold Rush Flowers. And she was kind enough to answer some questions about the restaurant, given her shop is right next door to the Decadent diner. That is why I came in here, not to buy flowers. Feeling like a babbling idiot, I considered the ramifications of running out the door, hopping into my car, and giving up on the restaurant entirely. I could fly to Venice. I could learn to steer a gondola and make that my new job. Wait, was my passport still valid? Slowly, oh so slowly, I raised my eyebrows. Those flowers aren't for me? Katie, the owner, gave me a sympathetic smile. It's nice to meet you, Tabitha. Likewise, I said, before my eyebrows came together. Those really aren't for me. Katie shook her head. Not unless your name is secretly Becky, and you're turning 16. Well, happy birthday to Becky, I said, smiling apologetically at Katie. And your shop is lovely. Thank you, she said, continuing to arrange the bouquet. I turned to Spencer. The suit? I asked. Went to my grandparents' graves, Spencer said. I winced. The card? Pick these up from my post office box, he said, waving his hand at me in a way that made me able to see there wasn't just one card, but instead a small stack of them in his grip. Condolences. My cheeks burned. Oh. Any other accusations? Spencer asked with that stupid grin of his. Or am I free to go? I have an explicitly non-romantic dinner with my new business partner. Sorry, I jumped to conclusions, I said, feeling lame. He winked at me. Don't worry about it. My stomach warmed, which was ridiculous. Ignoring my body's traitorous response to Spencer's wink, I managed a wave at Katie. It was very nice to meet you. I swear, I'm usually much more normal. There is just a lot of unresolved history between us, I said, thumbing to where Spencer was waiting at the front door. Happens to us all, Katie said, with a warm smile that made me like her immediately. She was petite and pretty too, making me wonder if she and Spencer had dated or if they were dating now. If so, she didn't seem the slightest bit jealous though. Huh. I made my way to the front door, which Spencer held open for me. After we were outside, he leaned close to my ear as we walked side by side down the sidewalk. Do you wish I had bought you flowers, Tabs? No, I said, quickening my stride to lose him. He increased his pace. I could go back and get some. Very funny. If you want me to, I will. I don't, I said firmly. He stopped. You're mad, I can tell. I'm not, I said, using a clip tone. I'll get you flowers, he said, turning around suddenly. I grabbed his arm. Stop, Spencer. Really? He stopped, turned back to me, and his body was inches from mine as we stood facing each other on the sidewalk. A car rolled by in the parking lot, the driver giving us a weird look. Whatever, buddy. I lifted my lashes to find green eyes peering down at me. My heart rate kicked up a notch. It was unfair that he was so handsome. Tell me the truth, he said, his voice gravelly. Gulp. What? He leaned closer, his face inches from mine. Do you want me to get you flowers? My breath left my chest. No, I whispered. What I wanted was for him to apologize for how he'd broken things off all those years ago, leaving me all alone when we'd talked about being together forever. What I wanted was for him to show the slightest indication that he felt sorry for hurting me so deeply. Or give me a sign that it had been just as hard for him without me. I'm sorry, he said quietly. My legs went weak, and I grabbed his arm for support. For what? I asked. He opened his mouth and then paused, holding my gaze, emotions storming through his eyes. My throat tightened as I remembered how hard I'd cried after he left. How I'd waited by the phone for him to come to his senses and return. That hadn't happened. What are you sorry for, Spencer? I asked, holding my breath. The muscles on his jaw twitched. For not buying you flowers, he said finally. My forehead wrinkled, and I pulled my hand away. Of course, he wasn't sorry for the damage he'd done. He was cold and heartless and hadn't loved me after all. I needed to keep that in mind and not expect anything decent from him until we could sell the Decadent diner to the highest bidder. 3 months was going to be an eternity. Thanks a lot, Mr. and Mrs. Black. Thanks for nothing. Chapter 4. Is it all right if I open the door for you, Tabs? Spencer asked, after we walked the short distance along the cracked sidewalk together from Gold Rush Flowers to the Decadent diner. Or will that make you believe that this is a date? A nice business partner would politely pretend I never made that mix-up, I said, giving him a meaningful look before crossing in front of him and pushing the door to the restaurant open myself. Except it didn't open, and I slammed into the door. Oof. That word above the handle is spelled P-U-L-L, Spencer said, rocking back and forth on his heels, a whistle practically on his lips. That means pull, not push. I'm glad I can amuse you, I said, ignoring the surely growing bump on my forehead and yanking the door open. Hope you enjoy my misery. He gave me a side glance. Seriously, you're okay, right? Yes, I said, ignoring the throb at my hairline. He gave a nod. Just so you know, you'd never be miserable with me if this were an actual date, he said, holding the door open with a smirk on his face. I couldn't help but laugh at his smug expression as I went into the restaurant ahead of him. You're way too confident that a date with you would be enjoyable. That sounds like a challenge, he said, following me inside. It's not, I assured him, waiting to be greeted by a host before being led to a table. No one came to welcome us, though. Not the woman standing behind the old-style counter, who was leafing through a magazine that looked like it had seen better days, not the young server who spilled tomato soup in a trail behind him as he passed in front of us without a word, and not the lone cook who I spied through the kitchen window with his chin dropped onto his chest as he snored over the snapping and popping of what smelled like burnt bacon. Are you sure this place is open and running? I asked. According to Mr. Fields, it's fully operational, Spencer said, looking as surprised as I felt. We'll have to take his word for it, I said, glancing around the nearly empty restaurant. The red booths appeared to be vinyl, the black and white checkered floor looked old, and the laminate countertops had maybe originally been white, but were definitely tinted yellow now. The phrase hole-in-the-wall restaurant came to mind. Maybe we should seat ourselves, Spencer said, as we watched the server come back from delivering the soup and nearly slip in the mess he'd made. He pulled a rag from his back pocket, knelt on the floor and swiped the cloth across the spilled soup. I hope he doesn't clean the tables with that towel, I said, cringing. Where should we sit? How about that spot in the corner, he suggested. We slid into the booth, and I noticed crumbs on the tabletop. Guess the guy hadn't used that towel, or any towel on the table. Was he receiving a steady paycheck? I'm sure the food will be good still, Spencer said, but he didn't sound too sure. He glanced around, trying to find a spot on the table to set his envelopes down, but there were coffee stains and smears of jam amongst the crumbs. No QR code on the table for a menu. Excuse me? I said, waving to the woman behind the counter, who looked surprised that I'd called her attention. Yes, hi. Could we get some menus, please? The woman's gray hair was pulled back into a bun, and she squinted at me under blue eyeshadowed lids. What's that? She squawked. A menu, I said, holding my hands in front of me as if I were holding a book, before mimicking opening and closing the book. Could we please get a menu? What do you want? She asked, tilting her head and cupping a hand behind her ear. I frowned and glanced over at Spencer, who laced his hands behind his head as he seemed to hold in a laugh. This should be interesting. We've inherited a menu-less restaurant, Spencer. This isn't a laughing matter, I said, hoping I didn't have to fire anyone. I was so not cut out for that kind of thing. I'd help you out if this were a date, Tabs. But it's not, so? He leaned forward, putting a fist to his mouth like he was holding back a fit of laughter, as if this situation were actually something to joke about. With this kind of service, my new restaurant must have so many bad online reviews, and surely any regular clientele had been scared away by this mess. Not good. Not good at all. We would like a menu, I said, using a louder voice so the woman behind the counter could hopefully hear me. A menu so we can decide what to order. I know what a menu is, so you don't have to shout, she said, rolling her eyes from across the restaurant without bothering to get any closer. They're drying off, so I can't get them yet. Just tell me what you want. Drying off? I asked, blinking rapidly. Timmy isn't too careful with the big cans of gravy and there was an accident, she said, wrinkling her nose. Not too careful with the soup either. The young server blushed as he passed Spencer and me, dropping off a couple of spoons at the table who ordered soup minutes ago. You two going to order, or what? The woman called out. I lifted a shoulder. I don't know what kind of food you serve. My goodness, lady, this is a diner, she said, throwing her hands up as if I were the most brainless customer on the face of the planet. Name any type of food, not anything fancy like with tofu or whatnot, but any regular type of food, and Davis back there will fry it up for you, with a side of coleslaw or a side of fries. You pick the side. My jaw dropped open. I didn't know where to start with retraining this woman, because she shouldn't treat customers like they are dumb. People worked hard for their money and deserve to be treated with respect when spending their money dining out. We'll take 2 burgers, Spencer said, giving me a look and leaning toward me. You haven't turned into a vegetarian on me, have you? Still stunned by the odd service, I shook my head. A burger is fine. The works on each, with a side of fries, he said, using an extra loud voice. Thank you kindly, ma'am. The woman shouted the order to the cook in the back, Davis presumably, who startled awake, and then she muttered, That one's got some sense at least. I turned to Spencer with wide eyes. Can you believe the lack of manners on that woman? He shrugged. It's diner food. What were you expecting? Is it me, or are her customer service skills needing improvement? Maybe it's just you, Tabs. Stop calling me that, I said, my tone flat. He frowned. That's what I've always called you. Yeah, well, that was a long time ago, I said, leaning back in my seat. We don't really know each other anymore, do we? Do people ever really change? He eyed me for a moment over the table and then shrugged, toying with a couple of sugar packets that looked like they had been sitting there for decades. Actually, I'd like to think people can grow. I suppose some people can, I said, thinking about how he hadn't shown up to his grandparents' funeral. At least he'd finally visited their gravesites. I fixed my stare out the window toward my car, thinking of the places it could take me far, far away. I couldn't tell Spencer that the real problem I had with him calling me Tabs was because it reminded me of the girl who had felt such self-assurance that she had a firm place in the world. Since he'd left town, it felt more like I'd been searching for something just out of reach. What did you want to talk about at this business dinner? I asked, feeling certain it would be too much to ask for a clean table or for the food to come out quick, let alone a dessert, or that after the meal we'd be able to pay quickly at a fully functioning cash register. So very unlikely. I mean, you invited me, so start the meeting. This is it, he said, gesturing around us. I glanced around the restaurant. There was the woman and her magazine at the counter. There was Timmy fumbling with a stack of plastic water cups by a cooler. Davis seemed to be awake and presumably cooking in the kitchen. The only other customers were a couple tasting the tomato soup and staring at each other without talking. Oh, please don't let them get food poisoning, I said, wondering if the insurance had been paid up to date. I turned back to Spencer. I'm scared to know what's in the soup. They're not going to get food poisoning, he said, shaking his head. I leaned forward, flattening my palms on the table, which landed on something sticky. I lifted my hand and stared at what looked like strawberry jam. No, you're right. Food poisoning is totally a far-fetched thought in a place as well kept up as this. I'm sure my grandpa picked a reasonable staff, Spencer said. As if on cue, the clattering sound of plates falling to the floor echoed across the diner. Timmy wore a horrified look as he grabbed a broom and bent down to sweep up the mess. Maybe he's new, Spencer said, the corner of his mouth lifting as a strange expression crossed his face. I remember dropping a plate or two when I started waiting tables here in high school. Do you remember that? My stomach tightened. I don't want to walk down memory lane with you, Spencer. We're supposed to be here talking about business. He leaned back, raking a hand through his hair. You've changed, Tabs. You used to be so. What? I asked. Easy going, he said finally. I sighed. You're right. I was easy going with you, and trusting. Look how well that turned out for me. I'm not going to make the same mistakes. We weren't a mistake, he said, his voice tight. People aren't perfect. I leaned toward him. I don't expect perfection, but I think honesty isn't too much to ask. You dumped me without warning after 2 years, Spencer. You can't expect me to treat you like we're the best of friends and that it didn't happen. He blew out a breath, leaning back in his seat. I'm sorry. I blinked, feeling unsure that I'd heard him right. What? I didn't handle things well, he said, his green-eyed gaze fixed on me. I was young and stupid. If I could go back and do things differently, I would. Stunned by the admission, I bit my bottom lip. He just laid a lot on me, and I needed time to process. We're supposed to be talking about the restaurant, I said, finally. No, we're here to assess the restaurant, he said, his shoulders relaxing a little. Is that what we're doing? I asked, thinking that might actually be a good idea. Yep. He smiled at me from across the booth, his eyes lighting up again. Tell me about yourself. What are you up to these days? Do you have a regular job? Glad to be talking about something other than our failed relationship. I twisted my lips. Nothing permanent right now. I've been dabbling in different careers, but haven't found anything that stuck. He nodded, seeming completely at ease in the long silence that ensued. He smiled across the booth at me. His smile was so easy, so charming. But I would not get sucked in again. What have you been up to? I asked. Oh, you know, he said, waving a hand in the air. Not going on dates here, not going on dates there. I rolled my eyes. Yeah, but really, I said. He rested a long, muscular arm across the back of the booth. Sorry, Tabs. Can't tell you. Top secret. I stared at him, waiting, but he didn't offer anything further. If he thought I cared that much about what he'd been up to, then he was wrong. I was just asking to pass the time until our burgers arrived, which seemed like it would be a long time from now. If you don't want to tell me anything personal, then don't, I said with a shrug. Fine by me. I'm only here to assess the restaurant with my business partner. He watched me steadily, that easy smile on his lips. Finally, he leaned forward and took my hand. Go on a date with me, and I promise not to keep a single thing from you. My tummy did a little flip, and I blinked. It took me so long to figure out whether or not he was serious that I totally forgot the most important part. I didn't want to go on a date with him. I didn't. I simply could not forget that. I'm going to see where our burgers are, I said, banging my knee against the underside of the table as I hurried out of the booth. And Spencer? He had no choice but to watch me leave. What I didn't know was whether or not I would return. My feelings for Spencer weren't buried far beneath the surface, but I needed to keep them there so I didn't get hurt a second time. Chapter 5. As the excess grease ran down my chin from my burger bite, I let out an audible groan and then set the rest of the burger on my plate next to the French fries. True, the Decadent diner needed a deep cleaning, remodeling, and the staff needed some motivation and major lessons in customer service. But on the upside, this was the best burger I'd ever tasted. Yum! Before checking on the possibly long-forgotten status of our order, I'd pondered getting in my car, driving off, and emailing Frank Fields to give my share of the restaurant away so I didn't have to see Spencer Black ever again. Although my sister would have surely lectured me on how I should have given the restaurant more of a chance, that wasn't why I'd returned. Mr. and Mrs. Black had left me the restaurant for a reason. They must have believed that I would do well running the restaurant they'd started so long ago. Otherwise, they would not have left it to me. The least I could do was hold out for the 3 months required to sell the place after they'd been so thoughtful to think of me after all these years. Well, Spencer said with a rather loud groan that matched mine. I think we both see what's obvious here. People don't come for the service, they come for the food. Good food isn't enough, I said, noticing an elderly couple come into the restaurant and greet the woman who was reading her magazine at the counter. Tabitha, Spencer said, waving a hand in front of me. Did you hear what I just said? Huh? I took another bite of my burger, feeling entranced by the older couple who were customers. They were dressed impeccably, a well-tailored suit for the man, a tea-length dress for the woman. The husband took the wife's trench coat and his hat, looked around for a coat hanger presumably before arranging the items carefully on the empty seat at the counter. Then he helped his wife onto a bar stool, and the way her fingers rested in his open palm as he helped her tugged at my heartstrings. They displayed a quiet, comfortable love, just like I wanted to have one day. The kind I'd only come close to with one person. Spencer, who had just apologized to me. Why had he done that? I didn't know what to make of that apology. Was he trying to make a fresh start with us? Was he just tying up loose ends? You're supposed to listen to me when we're on a date, Spencer said, waving a hand in front of my face. We're not on a date, I said, moving to my left so I could see the couple again. I continued to watch them as they talked to the woman behind the counter. Their soft-spoken demeanor was in sharp contrast with the loud responses from the woman. They asked politely for 2 cups of coffee, stating they had just come from the movie theater. I was horrified to hear the woman behind the counter inform them that the coffee machine was broken. There would be no coffee. No coffee in a diner? Such a travesty. They appeared disappointed and began gathering their things. I looked over at Spencer. Look, Tabs, we just need to face the facts here. And the facts are that? This business meeting is over, I said, taking one last delicious bite of my burger before I scrambled out of the booth, my feet slipping on the mint wrapper-littered floor and my fingers bouncing on the edge of the sticky table as I slid out and stood up. With a burst of sudden energy, I blurted, "It's time to take action." A look of confusion crossed Spencer's handsome face as I hurried away from the booth and rushed over to the couple. Tabitha, Spencer called after me. What are you doing? Hello, hi, welcome, I said, greeting the couple, panting a little from my mad dash and from my excitement. I waved my hands, ushering them back toward their bar stools. My name is Tabitha, and it's so nice to meet you. Welcome to the Decadent Diner. That handsome gentleman is shouting at you, the wife said, looking over at Spencer, who was saying something I couldn't hear. Is he your date? She asked. I shook my head. We're not on a date. I'm surprised to hear you say that, she said, her mouth working back and forth. You seemed like such a nice couple. Watch out, the man said with a chuckle. Esther can be quite the matchmaker. That's sweet, I said, not wanting to share the bad news that Spencer and I didn't stand a chance of getting back together. I'm more interested in helping the 2 of you today. The couple looked at me in bewilderment as I leaned close enough to the woman at the counter to scan her upside-down name tag that read, Tina. Hi, Tina, I said firmly as I gestured to the couple. Please wipe down the counter here and get these nice guests a slice of pie on the house, would you? I'm going to go get their coffee. Tina raised a thin eyebrow. Coffee machine is broken. Do we have beans? I asked, giving her a strong look as she shook her head. A grinder? A coffee pot? She shrugged. Well, no. Please get them pie while I get them coffee, I said, heading toward the front door. And who do you think you are, Missy? Tina called after me. Tabitha Smith, I said, returning to shake her hand and give her a serious look. I'm the new owner. Nice to meet you. She's the new co-owner, Spencer said, as I disappeared out the front door. If I remembered my friend's schedule right, Courtney's coffee cart should be about 3 blocks down the street right now. I felt exhilarated as I hurried down the sidewalk. That couple wanted coffee, and coffee I would give them. I was a diner owner, after all. I was walking fast, but Spencer caught up to me quickly using those long legs of his. I felt his arm brush mine as he rushed along beside me. When we were kids, I remembered those legs used to hang off the edge of my bed as we'd look up at the glow-in-the-dark stickers I'd put on the ceiling of my guest room at my grandparents' house. We'd smile and laugh as I taught him the constellations. "What exactly are you doing, Tabs?" he asked as I quickened my pace. No use whatsoever in losing him, but it made me feel good to make him exert more effort. "I'm trying a thing," I said, since I couldn't ditch him. "A thing?" he asked, shaking his head. "What are you talking about? What's gotten into you?" I leapt off the curb. "Wait." He snatched me back, just as I was about to cross into traffic to beat the yellow light. His palm splayed flat and secure across my stomach as he held me against him just as a car raced by. My heart pounded in my chest. "Oops. That was too close," he said, looking down at me. I gaped up at him. "Thanks. I didn't see that car." He held me against him as he let out a long, shaky breath. The feel of his body against mine sparked a memory from our past. A time when I'd driven 2 hours up to Sacramento from my hometown of Blue Moon Bay to go to his prom with him. Once I arrived, I found out he'd been suspended from school for starting a fight with a guy from gym class. When I'd pressed him about why he'd been suspended, he revealed the guy had said something insulting about his mother. Nothing specific, one of those insults that had nothing in reality to do with one's mother, just a kid acting like a jerk. When I didn't understand why such a petty comment would trigger him, Spencer revealed why he lived with his grandparents and why they were raising him. When he was only 8 years old, his parents had gone on vacation to Hawaii and had been killed in a tragic helicopter crash. I'd heard from my grandparents that he'd lost his parents, but I'd been too young to understand what death really meant at the time. Now that I was a teen, everything felt different. Spencer's eyes had filled with tears when he'd revealed the secret to me, and he'd seemed so open and vulnerable. That was the night I told him I loved him. He'd said he loved me too, and asked me to promise to never leave him, which I'd been happy to do. For our own private prom, we'd danced on a hill overlooking the Tower Bridge. I remembered the gold glow on his bruised cheek. "Walk sign," I said, stepping out of his embrace and into the throng of pedestrians crossing the street. The return to the present felt jarring, but necessary. No sense in thinking about my past. I had a job to do. "Like I was saying," he said, clearing his throat as he hurried to keep up with me. "The facts are there. We need to face them." "Yes, the fact is we need coffee," I said, blowing off whatever moment we'd just had on the sidewalk by striding across the busy plaza, waving my hands as I came upon Courtney Carmichael's coffee cart. "Courtney, coffee, it's an emergency. Help!" Courtney wore a black t-shirt with gold sequins that spelled out, "Life is good." She waved as I hurried toward her. "Hey, Tabitha. I was just closing up for the night. Need you and your coffee cart pronto at the Decadent diner," I said, grabbing her arm. "It's urgent." "Is that the restaurant you inherited? Next door to Gold Rush Flowers?" she asked. "Yes. And my diner has no coffee," I said, hoping she could grasp the gravity of the situation. "Not even a coffee pot, apparently." She looked momentarily horrified before kicking up the locks on her cart, sweeping everything into travel-safe bins, and pushing the cart in my direction. I knew I could count on Courtney. "Lead the way," she said. "You're totally saving me," I said, jumping up and down. "Reporting for duty, ma'am," she said with a salute, before turning her attention to Spencer. "And here's a very handsome stranger. Are you two on a date?" "No," I said at the same time that Spencer said, "It's complicated." "Not on a date?" I repeated with a firm look at Spencer. Glad that's clear, Courtney said with a growing grin. Would you like some help? Spencer asked, gesturing to the cart. Nah, but thanks for the offer, she said, turning to me. He's a keeper. Coffee, I said, trying to keep her focused on the issue at hand. We've got to hurry, I said, running along beside her. As we raced toward the restaurant, Courtney asked about the specifics of this coffee urgency on one side of me with questions like, are we talking 2 shots of espresso here? 3 shots? Surely not 4? Oh no, not decaf. While on the other side of me, Spencer was saying things like, no customers, no menus, although I did like that woman you were very unreasonable toward Tabs. I interrupted both of them when I swung open the door of the Decadent diner and announced with a giant smile on my face, we have coffee. It took me a while to realize that Spencer was talking to me. I was too busy watching the elderly couple sip their coffees and talk animatedly to Courtney. I felt like I'd done something right that evening, like I'd made someone's life better. Happier. Brighter. It felt good, like it was something. Like it could even be my thing. Tabs, I'm talking to you, Spencer said. I said to Spencer almost dreamily. I turned to him with a loopy smile. Maybe I'd finally found my thing, for real. It was hard to believe. Spencer's palms were on the table, and he wore a serious look. I nearly laughed. It's obvious that we both agree, he said, a line forming between his eyebrows. So let's just say it. I nodded in agreement. Then, at the exact same time, Spencer said, we should sell after 3 months, as I said, brimming with excitement. We absolutely should not sell after 3 months. My forehead wrinkled. We were so not on the same page, making me wonder why in the world Mr. and Mrs. Black had thought we'd make good business partners. Chapter 6. Spencer stared down at me wide-eyed, as if he couldn't believe I didn't want to sell the Decadent diner. In fact, I couldn't understand why he would want to sell his inheritance from his beloved grandparents, who had raised him. You haven't even given the diner a chance, I said, staring up at him, jutting my chin up like a boxer hitting above her weight class, and not afraid. Neither one of us backed down. Neither one of us relented. Neither one of us budged. Well, not until Spencer took my hand and led me toward a clearly out-of-service photo booth in the back corner of the restaurant. He pulled aside the red velvet curtain that had seen better days and ushered me inside, following after I was seated. I was honestly surprised the bar holding the curtain hadn't clattered to the floor since Spencer had tugged on it hard to enclose us in the tight space. Why are we in here? I asked. We shouldn't argue in front of the staff, he whispered. But it's okay to argue in a photo booth with a tiny curtain? I said in a loud whisper. Our sides were pressed together as I stared at his reflection in the photo booth glass because there was nowhere else to move in here and nothing else to do. It's better than arguing out there, he said. How is this better? I said, gesturing back and forth between us. I wasn't thinking, okay, he said, blowing out a breath, clearly exasperated. I can't think straight around you. You think you're the one who has it hard? I asked, guffawing. How do you think it feels inheriting a restaurant with the guy who broke my heart? His eyes widened in the reflection before he turned to me. Tabs, I said I was sorry. You think that magically takes off the last decade? I asked, snapping my fingers. You think that makes me have the warm fuzzies around you again? I'm trying to be civil, Spencer. But you're not making it easy. What can I do? He asked, his tone dropping an octave. Tell me how I can make you understand how scared I was back then. Scared of what? Of me? I asked, putting a hand to my chest. Yes, he said in a very loud whisper. Of losing you. My mouth dropped open. You pushed me away. You made us lose each other. How did that solve anything? Like I said, he said, his tone gentle, I was young and stupid. I'm not saying it was a good decision. It's the biggest regret of my life. My eyes watered and I shook my head. That was a long time ago. It doesn't matter anymore. He took my hand in his. It doesn't? My throat tightened as I pulled my hand away. The only thing that matters is our business partnership. We need to do right by the diner. That's what I'm trying to do, he said firmly. We need to decide what kind of layoff package we can afford to offer the staff. You're giving up too quickly, I said, my eyebrows knitting together. But I guess that has always been your MO. Spencer flinched as if I'd hit him. I don't expect you to understand. You grew up surrounded by your parents, grandparents, and sister. You had everything that matters. I'm sorry for all of your losses, Spencer, I said, knowing I didn't have the first clue what it would be like to lose my parents. But I'm not going to make you feel better about giving up on this place. That's not the answer. If anything, it would just be you losing another piece of your past. And is it getting hot in here, or is it just me? It's not just you, he said, his voice low and gravelly. Immediately, I began rearranging how I was sitting. Our elbows knocked against each other in the four impossibly close walls, and our knees hit the tiny little bench, and our foreheads collided as we maneuvered unsuccessfully. I ended up on the bench with my neck craned, hand on Spencer's shoulder to steady myself. He ended up pressed back against the digital screen, his boots wedged against the back wall. We were both breathing heavily at this point. We stared at each other in the enclosed space that felt way too cozy. I wanted to stay mad at him, but my heart squeezed thinking of how much he must be hurting deep down right now. Emotions swirled in those green eyes of his, making me want to wrap my arms around him and hold him close. Not a good idea. Comfy now? He asked finally. I'm perfectly fine, I said, although my neck was getting a pinch and my arms were trembling from holding myself up straight. I'll stay here until you agree to give this restaurant a chance, because I love every part of it. I felt surprised to hear myself say it, but realized the words were true. I loved the Decadent diner. I'd finally found my thing. Now, I just had to keep Spencer from taking the restaurant away from me. I needed to convince him to keep it. Which part do you love exactly? He asked, the corner of his mouth curving upward. The warm smiles that greet you when you walk in? The decor that is one sneeze away from falling over? The unique food, packed with vitamins and antioxidants and minerals that will for sure attract a modern clientele? Or is it the high-demand location? I mean, I'm surprised you can hear me over all the foot traffic going on outside. You attract a lot of girlfriends with that attitude, Mr. Negative. I blurted. Spencer squirmed against the display and it beeped. Is that your way of asking if I have a girlfriend? My cheeks heated. That's not what I meant, N. I don't, he said, lifting his hand and brushing his fingers along my jawline. To be honest, Tabs, I haven't dated anyone special since you. This place has a lot to offer if you would give it a chance, I said, trying to move our conversation to a safe topic since my pulse rate had kicked up at his admission. After all, he'd just made it clear he wasn't dating the pretty brunette next door in the flower shop. Nope, he was single, I was single, and, he was still stroking my jawline. Gulp. Just because you're afraid of putting in some elbow grease, just because you're afraid of breaking a little sweat, just because you're afraid of getting your hands a little dirty, doesn't mean I am. Sometimes it's better to let things go, he said, his finger gliding back and forth across my cheek, leaving a trail of tingles in its wake. We're keeping the restaurant, I said, inhaling a slow breath, trying to calm my racing heart. He really needed to stop brushing my cheek. But I didn't think it was my job to tell him to stop. After all, he was a grown man, right? And it felt so good. His gaze dropped to my lips. We need to sell the diner. No, we're keeping it, I said, wondering if he was going to kiss me. Maybe I should kiss him? I mean, we were both single. It's not like it would be against the law. He leaned closer to me. We're selling. We're not, I said, throwing my hands up, or at least I tried to. It wasn't really possible in the tight confines of the photo booth. Instead, I hit the wall with my knuckles. We're acting like children, he said. You're acting like a child, I said, which admittedly sounded a little childish. Sometimes it's best to admit when something can't be saved, he said, cupping my cheek. And who are you to decide when something can't be saved? I asked, my voice barely making a sound. If he didn't kiss me soon, I was seriously going to explode. He shook his head slowly. It's too hard. Then let someone help you, I said, biting my bottom lip. He hesitated, his gaze lifting to mine. Are we still talking about the restaurant? Huh? I asked before shaking my head. The restaurant? Oh, right. I mean, yes, of course, we're talking about the restaurant. What else would we be talking about? I asked, my voice sounding a little panicked. Was it because, without realizing it, I had shifted into talking about us? The restaurant can be saved, I said, to both Spencer and to myself. We can get people to teach us how to train the staff. We can hire an interior designer. We can lean on other successful restaurant owners for advice and support. That's obviously what I meant. I wasn't talking about, there isn't anything else I would have been talking about. He stared at me, the muscles on his temple twitching as he held my gaze. The air in the photo booth had gone even thicker than it already was. It was hot. He and I were far too close. I watched with mounting fear as he opened his mouth hesitantly. You know, Tabs, he said, his voice serious, and suddenly I wanted him to stop talking. I wasn't sure I was ready to hear whatever he was about to say. You weren't the reason that I left all those years ago. You know that, right? My eyes watered. I can't do this. I couldn't hear anymore. I wanted out of the photo booth, and I wanted out now. I pushed at Spencer a little to dislodge myself, feeling like an inadvertent puzzle piece. The machine beeped again, and it began to take pictures as Spencer tried to move out of my way. The flashes were still going off as I wrenched back the curtain to find the entire staff of the Decadent diner, all three of them, stumbling back from the booth where they had clearly been huddled listening to us. Their ears immediately went red, but I didn't care. Spencer looked embarrassed as he came out after me, glancing at the staff he'd just said he planned on laying off. Don't worry, I said, waving my hands dismissively. I'm going to do everything in my power to bring this diner back to its old glory. My co-owner will be seeing himself out. As if on cue, a series of cards dropped from the little slot, and Spencer seemed taken by surprise when I picked them up and shoved them against his chest. Keep these, I said, my forehead wrinkling and a shield forming around my heart. Now, you have a photo of me leaving. Chapter 7. It usually wasn't all that hard to find a reason why my latest thing couldn't end up being my forever thing. So maybe I should have thanked Spencer and his constant interruptions, frustrations, and derailments over the next week, because without him I might have found a dozen reasons to pack up my bags, close shop, and sign the papers to sell once the required days were up. I mean, there were plenty of challenges to choose from. Little to no marketing for the restaurant, Tina's unenthusiastic service, or peeling wallpaper to name a few. Spencer seemed to think each obstacle was an excuse to sell the diner. Well, little did he know that his determination to sell only reinforced my efforts to see this through. I mean, not him per se. Just the spirit of competition. The thrill of victory. The drive to watch him eat his words, which it turned out was a very strong drive inside me. The competition started the day after the photo booth incident. I came into the Decadent diner with a booklet of paint swatches, a magazine on interior design, and a pair of bright, eager eyes. Spencer came in with a camera and a tape measure. I heard the click and flash of the camera and turned around to see Spencer pointing the camera directly at me, blinding me with another photo. "What are you doing?" I asked as I held two colors up against the old, faded wallpaper, which was less and less surprisingly splattered with tomato soup, which I learned came from a can. Shudder. Buyers might like to see that a beautiful woman dared enter this doomed ghost town of a restaurant, he said, taking another photo of me. Makes the restaurant seem a little less sad. The diner is not sad, it's going through a transformation, I said, as I blinked to find I had been debating between two shades of gray that basically looked the same. I hid those options behind my back. This place isn't going to be sad at all after the improvements. Timmy picked that very moment to drop and shatter half a dozen coffee mugs against the checkered floor. Sigh. Spencer glanced over his shoulder just as the kid's red face disappeared beneath the counter. Good thing I didn't inventory those yet, Spencer said, shaking his head. Wouldn't want to be dishonest toward any future investors. It's okay, Timmy, I said, shouldering past Spencer and his camera to meet him behind the counter. I'm ordering new mugs anyway. Spencer draped an arm over my shoulder. Do you suppose this restaurant will ever have coffee and coffee mugs on the same day? I rolled my eyes and Timmy stifled a laugh, which died quickly when he saw my gaze. Don't encourage him, Timmy. He's joking, Timmy said, glancing over at Spencer. I think. Spencer nodded. Of course I'm joking. Don't worry about it, Timmy. Tabs is thrilled to order new mugs. She loves shopping. There's nothing wrong with shopping, I said, hating that he still knew me so well after all these years. Things didn't improve between Spencer and me after the mug incident. And while I wasn't exactly proud to say that I'd stooped to Spencer's level, I will at least say in my defense that I did it for the sake of the restaurant. Were some of my actions childish? Maybe. But he started it. And it had become some kind of game between us. When I happened upon the edge of Spencer's measuring tape, hooked on the metal leg of a chair, I lifted the chair to inspect it, but only for the purpose of judging how much restoration they would need. If that measuring tape rattled and sprung back with a snap into the device again, well, that was just cause and effect. Just like when I asked Spencer why he'd scrubbed off the gray squares of paint I'd lathered against the wall with my brush to test potential colors in the restaurant's light, he insisted there had been a splash of ubiquitous tomato soup in that very spot. He reiterated that if he was going to sell the place, then the walls simply needed to be clean. Then when I slowly walked a bag of rotted potatoes through the kitchen, pausing to check my nails multiple times while heading toward the garbage dumpster out back, how was I supposed to know that I was photobombing Spencer's test photos in there that he was taking for the listing? Next, Spencer claimed my paint swatches did really look like coasters, and so it was totally reasonable for him to pack them up for storage in the bottom box of a large, heavy stack. This game between us went on and on. At night I found myself plotting new ways to get him back, and more than once I giggled at the clever ways he thwarted me. That whole week I didn't really accomplish much, but there was pleasure in knowing that neither had Spencer. And judging by his grin as he watched me scrubbing the gray paint Timmy accidentally knocked over onto the floor, big sigh, he felt the exact same way. Can you believe how ridiculous Spencer is acting? I said, complaining to Courtney and her neighbor Curtis, who were in the diner's kitchen eating a couple of burgers on the house. Curtis was Courtney's neighbor, who had moved next door to her a few months ago. After an ongoing argument over the dilapidated fence between their homes and how high the quotes for a new fence were, they finally broke down and started building a new fence together. After hearing all of the terrible stories about how stubborn and thoughtless Curtis was to not want a cedar fence that would match the rest of Courtney's yard, it was weird seeing them having a good time together. It's hard to believe how stubborn Spencer is being about improving the diner, Courtney said, wearing a smirk as she exchanged a look with Curtis. Sometimes, stubborn people need to realize when the other person knows best. These are the two you were telling me about, who need a do-over date? Curtis asked, dipping a fry into some ketchup on the edge of his plate. Spencer and I are not dating, I said, watching Spencer as he tried to tack up a for sale sign to the window I'd greased so the sign wouldn't stick. Ha! True, they aren't currently dating, Courtney said in a teasing tone. But Tabitha is having an awfully good time not dating him. Just like we are, Curtis said, his tone serious. Well, I have been enjoying building the fence with you ever since you realized cedar was the best way to go, Courtney said, her tone meaningful. It has been fun, he said, pausing for a moment. I almost don't want the project to end next week. Maybe I'll knock it down so we'll have to start over. At the unusual comment, I checked over my shoulder and found the two of them sitting close together, practically hip to hip. Courtney was dipping a fry into some of Curtis's ketchup, as he waited in obvious anticipation for her to answer. I wouldn't say no to another project with you, she said, popping the fry into her mouth before smiling at him. Would you say no to going out to dinner with me on Friday night? He asked, taking her hand in his and gazing into her eyes. Courtney put a hand to her chest. Do you mean to talk about the project, or, he said simply. My entire body froze as I realized Curtis had just asked Courtney out on a date. This had somehow turned into a private moment between them, and I felt like I should leave the room to give them some space. Although another part of me wanted to hear the answer. Or, Courtney said, repeating the word as if to be clear that was what he was saying. Yes, or, he said, putting his other hand over hers. Oh, or, she said, realizing fully that he was asking her out. Courtney was a super smart woman, so the fact that she was having trouble understanding him meant that she had feelings for him as well. I'd expected as much, with all of their silly feuding over fence quotes these past few months. Well? Curtis asked, giving her a hopeful look. What's it going to be? I would love to or dinner with you on Friday night, she said, her voice unusually emotional. I'm glad we have that settled, he said, returning to his burger with one hand but continuing to hold her hand with his other. They were so cute, I wanted to add my approval. Instead, I took a bite of one of Courtney's coffee cart pastries and moaned. What is in this? I asked. Orange zest in the cream cheese of the cinnamon roll, Courtney said, her voice sounding giddy. You'd think the two would clash, but they complement each other nicely. Some things do indeed, Curtis said, beaming at Courtney. I drummed my fingers on the counter and glanced over at Spencer. And other things just clash, something one wouldn't miss once it was gone again. Courtney laughed and said, while smiling at Curtis, I don't know. Some things are so good you can't remember a time before them. Okay, it was time to leave the room so these two could have their first kiss already. Heading out of the kitchen, I tried to remember a time before Spencer, and failed. He had certainly become a part of my life at a young age. But I certainly could remember a time after him, a time filled with heartache and pain. And that was not something I cared to repeat again. Chapter 8. It was the official end of my second week at the Decadent diner, and all I wanted was to rest my feet and have 2 minutes of peace. My efforts to revamp the restaurant had not achieved as much as I would have liked. Partially due to Spencer's antics, but partially because I couldn't make the numbers work. My plans were too grand, and the depleted bank account was too small. The personal money I did have seemed hardly capable of buying enough air fresheners to make the place not smell dusty. I was starting to feel as if I were in over my head. It seemed like I had no realistic destination. In short, I felt defeated. All I wanted to do at this very moment was plop into an empty booth and sulk. Pout. Stare out the window dejectedly. I deserved a small pity party after all of the effort I had put in before I got back to work. But the very moment I sank down into an empty booth, it was no longer empty, because Spencer slid into the bench across from me. I sighed, needing a moment to myself. "Spencer." "I got here first," he said, the corners of his mouth lifting. "No," I said, slumping over the somehow still sticky table. "I definitely got here first." "You weren't even close to getting here first," he said, setting an arm across the top of the booth behind him. "And I'd like to enjoy my booth in peace." With my chin dropped on my fist, I raised an eyebrow. "Why do you need peace all of a sudden?" He let his head fall back and stared up at the old square ceiling tiles. "Struck out," he said with a sigh. I tilted my head. "Dare I ask, with what?" "No takers on the diner," he said, as if the answer were obvious. "No bites. Not even a single nibble." At this point, I probably couldn't give this place away. Stop smiling. Stop smiling right now. "It's not like I've had much luck myself these past weeks," I said, lifting a shoulder. "I have all these plans for the restaurant, but you can only stretch a penny so far." The corner of his mouth lifted. Champagne taste on a beer budget? More like marble taste on a linoleum budget, but yeah, I said, staring at Spencer. At the stubble that seemed permanently attached in a sexy way along his jawline. At his green eyes that stared wistfully out the window, toward the setting sun over the empty parking lot. At his lips, which used to taste like the snickerdoodle cookies he would sneak from his grandmother's cookie jar. "I guess it's both of our pity booth then," I said. "It was my pity booth first," he joked. "Yes, but I feel more defeated than you do," I said seriously, dropping my head to the table. Why hadn't I put more money in savings, just in case I inherited a restaurant one day? Let me wallow in peace. In the dark cave of my despair, I heard footsteps clip along the tile and assumed that Spencer was doing what I'd told him to do, leaving. But then I heard scraping across the table and something cold, hard, and wet pressed against my folded hands. "What the?" I parted my fingers to see Tina retreating from the booth and walking toward the magazine she'd left on the counter. "Huh?" When I lifted my head, I found an overpoured chocolate milkshake piled high with whipped cream, topped with several glistening cherries, and 2 curly-Q straws. And behind the delicious-looking shake sat Spencer. Still there. Staring at me. "I think Tina is warming up to us," he said, with a hint of a smile on his lips. "Now, let me have a sip." Tina grumbled something incomprehensible from the counter, before she licked a finger and flipped a page of her magazine. I eyed the milkshake warily. "We're not really going to share this milkshake, are we?" I asked, my heart rate kicking up a bit. I watched Spencer drag his pinky in a line through the billowy whipped cream. He sucked his finger into his mouth and then said, "You stay on your side. And I'll stay on mine." I rolled my eyes, but my mouth was watering. So I sat up and leaned closer to the milkshake as Spencer did the same. I was moving toward the straw and the straw only, but neither of us had our eyes on our straws. Our gazes were locked. I found my breath quickening as we moved closer and closer toward each other. I kept waiting for him to pull back. To stop. To retreat. To leave once more. To leave the booth. The restaurant. My life. But he kept leaning forward, and so did I. A moment later, our noses bumped, and a burst of laughter escaped me, before we sipped the delicious milkshake at the same time. Cold, rich, sugary deliciousness filled my mouth, and I found myself wishing we'd kissed. Just once. No big deal. But oh, how I wanted it. I pulled back from my straw the instant Spencer moved back, though, so I wouldn't be the fool left slurping alone. "You know," Spencer said, tracing the old tabletop with his finger. "Since neither of us is having much success in our goals." "I don't want to sell," I said, stopping him from changing my mind. "And I don't want to keep," he said, tapping the tabletop and nodding at me as if he were figuring something out. But at the moment, our motives might be aligned. I crossed my arms. How? Spencer continued to trace a set of small letters on the table that I couldn't quite make out. I could see they were well worn, probably carved decades ago. Well? He shrugged, his finger moving along the indentation. We both need the space spruced up. For me, so I can sell it. For you, so you can keep it going. Your constraint is money, and I have money. I drummed my fingers against the table's edge, wondering what he was getting at. I narrowed my eyes at him. If we use your money to remodel the place, then what happens once we fix it up? I asked. He smiled and shrugged. Then it's back to war tabs. I grinned. For real? Cross my heart. I tilted my head. You're offering a temporary peace treaty? Yep. With a nod, he extended his hand over the milkshake with its 2 straws. A temporary peace treaty. We shook on the deal, and relief swept through me. Now I could remodel the place the way I longed to, and we'd just deal with the other stuff later. I was grateful for this deal. My gaze lowered to the indentations he'd been tracing, and with his fingers gone, I could finally make them out. I frowned. Hey, I said, leaning closer. That couldn't be. No, Spencer said, shaking his head. Not possible. But it is. I said, my chest lifting. Did your grandparents used to? A coincidence, I'm sure, he said, his eyes widening. Merely a coincidence. A heart was carved on the tabletop, and inside was IF plus LB, the initials of Spencer's grandparents, Ida Fields and Lester Black. My vision blurred as my gaze met his, and it was like the energy of a magnet was pulsing between us. It was like fate itself sat on the table in front of us. But it wasn't fate that had brought us back together. It had been his grandparents, whose love was still displayed on this table after so many years. We're not getting rid of these tabletops, I said firmly. Agreed, he said. And for once there was no argument between us. Chapter 9. On Sunday night, Spencer and I began cleaning, deep cleaning, after the Decadent diner closed for the evening. It was past midnight, and we had collected a mountain of dried and brittle wads of gum, swept up enough dust to keep us sneezing for days, and scrubbed down every dish, surface, wall, corner, and square inch we could see. All that was left was to give the floor the good mopping it deserved. I was fairly sure I could still see remnants of the tomato soup stain from the very first day Spencer and I had come in here several weeks ago, which felt more like a year. As I filled a bucket with soapy hot water, my imagination wandered to warmer days, younger days, Spencer and I laying side by side on his grandparents' back lawn, staring up at a sea of glittering stars. I could almost hear the distant soft murmur of their old gramophone as we snuck a peek at the Christmas presents his grandparents had sitting under their tree. I turned off the water, brought my bucket to the floor at the entrance, and glanced up to see Spencer cleaning the grimy windows. All too suddenly, I remembered Spencer standing outside my window on a hot summer night. His crooked grin caught in the moonlight, and his long hair fell over one flashing green eye as he pointed to the latch, and I crawled out of bed, careful not to let the mattress creak. My mind indulged in the memories of that evening, his smile rising up and flashing in my head as he'd leaned down to kiss me. I stopped myself from thinking about our old romance further. I pushed those songs out of my head. Because it was too painful. The quiet of the restaurant was interrupted by the scraping sounds of table legs against the floor as he pushed everything he could against one wall. Chairs were stacked high against the door as if we were barricading ourselves inside. Against what I wasn't sure. We were more likely to attack each other than anyone from the empty parking lot outside coming in. With a sigh, I sloshed a big bucket of warm, soapy water across the tiled floor, and then decided a mop would be much easier. When I came back from the storeroom with 2 dingy old mops, I found Spencer by the jukebox holding out an open hand. I already cleaned the jukebox, I said. Are you sure? I frowned. Yes, I cleaned every nook and cranny. It's good. I think I see a spot, he said, his back to me. The light from the jukebox outlined his broad shoulders and his muscular arms. My gaze dropped to his backside. Nobody should look that good in a pair of pants. Not fair. I didn't miss anything, I said, annoyed with myself for wanting to wrap my arms around his trim waist. I resisted, of course. It's clean. Now let's work on the floor. I took a step toward him to hand him the mop, and so he could move into less flattering light, when he said, "Ah yes, right here." Suddenly, music filled the restaurant. In the still of the night, by the five satins belted out in its smooth tones, seeming to fill every corner of the diner. His grandparents used to play this song and dance around the kitchen. The image of them dancing made my eyes water. Spencer turned around, looked at me and smiled. I blinked away the tears. Don't say it. What? Spencer raised his palms, as if to prove he wasn't guilty. I shook my head. Don't even think it, I said. What? He said, swaying back and forth to the music in rhythmic moves. I'm not saying or thinking anything at all. Good, I said, thinking he looked adorable. He snapped his fingers. In the still of the night. Yep, way too adorable. Okay, let's dance, I said. His lips curved upward. You want to dance with me? Well, since you asked so nicely. That was a cheap trick, I said, setting the mop aside and wiping my hands on my pants while he walked toward me. I'm not going to let you get away with antics like that, Spencer. The reflection of the jukebox light flickered across his handsome face as he danced his way over to me, stopping a foot away when I held my palm out. I am not going to dance with you, I said. His green eyes sparked in the light of the jukebox, the only light still on in this old 50s-style restaurant. But you said you wanted to dance, he said, reaching for my hand. You enticed me into saying that, I said, my voice growing soft as his hand wrapped around mine. The warmth of his skin felt familiar against mine, so comforting. Maybe I did, he said, leading me to the center of the floor, away from the wet spots I'd been cleaning. But you're voluntarily holding my hand, aren't you? Good point. Well, it's a good song. He pulled me close, curling our linked hands to his chest. I breathed him in as the music played, and his hand pressed the small of my back. He leaned down to whisper, "And I didn't make you sway the way you're swaying right now." I laid my cheek against Spencer's chest. Aha! And I didn't make you smile like that, he said softly. I'm not smiling, I said, since I was busy melting against him. He studied my face with those dazzling green eyes. You sure you're not smiling? Looks that way to me. I smiled despite myself. See, he said, but I just shook my head and placed my cheek back against his chest. We danced together and it felt like old times, maybe better. Back then, I hadn't known how special what we had was. Now I was 27 and had dated plenty of guys, but never had I felt a connection like this. My tummy swirled. Do you remember prom? He said, his breath warm against my ear. I knew he meant the prom on the hill. He couldn't have meant the other one, since I'd spent that one alone, after he'd abandoned me. Don't remember it at all, I lied, not wanting to lose my heart to him, even though I knew it was already too late. We had the whole place to ourselves, he said, sounding lost in his memories. The lights shining on the water below us, he continued softly, his voice far away. And suddenly I saw it here, just as it had been many years ago. The light from the jukebox shining on the water-covered floor where I'd been mopping. The dark of the night outside at this late hour. The flecks of the formica like stars. He rested his cheek against the top of my head. That night meant so much to me, Tabs, he whispered. And just like that, I remembered the pain in my chest from him leaving. The tears I'd cried, wishing he'd come back. Being in his arms no longer felt safe, just scary. I jerked away suddenly, in a moment of utter self-preservation. The song is over. Wait. Nope, it's over, I said, averting my gaze so he couldn't see how distraught I was. Now, I need to clean the rest of this floor. Back to work, and the reason we're here. He stood in the same spot, staring at me as I walked away. But I ignored his hurt look. He was the one who had left, not me. Yep, I remembered that night on the hill all too well, with the romantic lights and the music from the motorcycle speaker and Spencer there with me. That had been the night I was sure I would have what the Blacks had, a beautiful love story that lasted a lifetime. I didn't want to revisit that night anymore because I knew what that night had actually been, a false promise. I went over and turned off the jukebox. Then I turned on the overhead lights and began to mop up the waters, which now looked like what they really were, dirty, soapy sloshes that resembled my heart broken to pieces. I could not let that happen a second time. Chapter 10. Well, it was my fault for getting stood up on Friday night. I really couldn't be mad at anyone but myself. When an ex-boyfriend ends up being exactly who you thought they were, there just wasn't anybody else to blame for you getting your feelings hurt yet again but yourself. And like I said, I knew it was my fault. Okay, yes, it was partly my sister's fault that I dressed up for this redesign meeting with Spencer tonight. I mean, Carrie was the one who had invited Courtney over for margaritas and insisted they style me. But it was my fault for letting them dress me up. It was nothing too fancy or anything. Just a flouncy 50s-style skirt I'd bought at a thrift store, while dreaming I'd be able to afford to remain an owner of this old-time restaurant I loved, with its carved-on tables, black and white checkered floor, and cool jukebox. I may have also put on a swipe of red lipstick and done a quick curl of my hair. But it was only my fault for letting my heart go pitter-patter like a schoolgirl's as I'd waited for Spencer to arrive at the Decadent diner tonight. My fault for ordering a chocolate milkshake from Tina, asking for extra cherries like before, and requesting that a second straw be added when the milkshake had arrived with only one. And then he didn't show. I'd watched the cherries sink into the melted whipped cream. I'd sat in this booth wearing that cute skirt whose crinoline turned out to be scratchy. That stuff should seriously come with a warning label. So it was my fault that familiar pain stabbed me in my stomach as the hand on the vintage vinyl record clock hanging on the wall moved and moved and moved, and yet the front door of the Decadent diner did not. As I sat there feeling oh so stupid, Timmy came over to wipe up the melted whipped cream mess that my untouched milkshake had dripped on the table. "Don't bother," I said, feeling numb. Timmy gave me an unsure look before walking away looking crestfallen. I hadn't meant to hurt his feelings. He had seriously improved his cleaning skills over these past few weeks. Spencer had taught him how to carry a tray, how to pour without spilling, and how to talk to a customer without turning beet red. Guilt churned in my already upset stomach. "I'm sorry, Timmy," I said, hoping to heal someone's wounded heart. He turned and gave me a flat smile and a raised shoulder, which I took to mean that he forgave me. Thank goodness. My face felt numb, my arms felt numb, and all that came through the numbness was the pain in my belly. I stared at the clock, watching that hand move and move. With each passing minute, I grew more upset with myself for getting excited about tonight. What had I been thinking? It had been that dance to In the Still of the Night last Sunday. Clearly, the 5 Satins were partially to blame. I dreamed about that dance all week, and how good it had felt being close to Spencer. And he'd been so helpful all week at organizing the financial books and ordering supplies that I'd let myself get excited about tonight. Tina approached my booth and slid a piece of apple pie onto the table in front of my humiliated milkshake. Then she hurried away, as if my grim condition could be catchy. I ignored the pie slice. I didn't think Tina would ever be what someone would call warm, but our strange relationship had taken tiny steps forward since I took over running this place. She even acknowledged me with a grunt and a jerk of her chin each morning. Progress. She'd slipped soft caramels into my pocket yesterday when I'd slumped over the table after spending the day opening our social media accounts and adding the diner to all of the searchable restaurant sites. Tina always acted without comment, but without fail. And she'd almost smiled at me when I complimented her new Courtney-taught coffee-making skills before catching herself and burying her face in a magazine. As I waited for the slice of pie to grow old and wither, I could feel her watching me from her spot behind the counter. But I had no appetite. Next, Davis came over from the kitchen, good to know he was awake in case a customer decided to walk in, and delivered some piping hot fries straight from the fryer. "Tabitha, Tabitha," he said, sounding like he was coaxing a dog from under a table. "You have got to eat something." "I'm sorry, Davis," I said without glancing up at him. "But I can't right now." Even with my eyes still fixed on the doorway of the restaurant, I could see Davis's shoulders slump as he meandered back to the kitchen. I was being unfair. This odd little family was growing together, improving together, working towards something together. But in this moment, I just felt defeated. When the front door finally opened and Spencer walked in an hour and a half late, carrying a big box, my hurt feelings turned into a foul mood. He'd obviously been packing, getting ready to leave once he sold this place. And I'd been sitting here, always waiting for him. "Hey Tabs," he said. "Nice of you to finally show up," I said, pushing myself from the booth. The milkshake I'd gotten for the two of us fell over, splattering big glops of brown onto my skirt. "Great, just great." "That in a hurry to see me, Tabs?" he said, but his laughter died on his lips when I glared at him. "What's going on?" "You said we were having a meeting and that was almost 2 hours ago," I said, stalking past him. "Really? What for?" I swung around to face him. "The redesign meeting? 7 o'clock. Ring any bells?" "I didn't realize that was set in stone," he said. "When you pick a time and confirm with the other party, it becomes set," I said. He set the big box he was holding on the nearest table and caught my wrist as I stormed toward the front door. "Hey, I just forgot." "I'm sorry." "Words you need to say way too often," I said, jerking my hand away. A line formed between his eyebrows. "Tabs." The staff was watching us, Tina from her normal spot behind the counter, Timmy from a booth where he'd been collecting dirty dishes, and Davis from the window to the kitchen. The bosses were putting on a show for them. Not very professional. "I was stupid to think that you might not do this," I said, waving my hand at the box. "Do what?" he said, his gaze darting to mine. "Have an imperfect memory?" "Me waiting on you has always been the problem," I said, throwing my arms wide. Every time he'd run away from his grandparents' house, he could only see things from his point of view. He needed some space, he had to get away for a bit, he had to do what he had to do. But where did that leave the rest of us? Where did it leave me? Always waiting, checking the window across the street as a teen, checking the front door of the diner as an adult. Always hoping he would return. Well, I wasn't going to wait anymore. "Enjoy your redesign meeting on your schedule," I said before storming out. All I cared about was getting out of this stupid 50s-style skirt. It was like evidence of my humiliation that I needed to destroy. Evidence that I still liked Spencer after all these years. Evidence that I still cared. I wasn't even really mad at him. Like I said, it was my fault. I just didn't want to be left again. So this time, I'd be the one to leave first. Chapter 11. I arrived at the diner the next day with the intention of apologizing to Timmy, to Davis, and to Tina, if she would actually look up from her magazines. I planned to inform them that I had no idea how to keep this restaurant, that Spencer wanted to sell it when the required 3 months had elapsed, and I had no way to buy him out. Instead, I stepped inside and saw 2 people I never expected to see again. And I knew in that moment that I could not ever give up on the Decadent diner. I knew that somehow this had to work out, because I knew that I was home. As the door closed behind me, my hand went to my mouth and my eyes watered. The giant wedding photo of Mr. and Mrs. Black, displayed in front of me, had always been my favorite picture of them. I stood frozen in the doorway as my gaze traveled over the space above the window to the kitchen, along the walls behind the booths, up and down the support beams, down the hallway toward the restrooms. There were photos everywhere. I took in all the pictures with a flutter to my heart, like a ray of sunshine after a long storm and a hug from a long-lost friend. Spencer watched me from the kitchen and then came out to stand beside me, since I was completely unable to move. He stuffed his hands into his pockets and then rocked back and forth on his heels. "He'd done all this? I figured since I messed up with you on the redesign meeting, it would be better if I showed you what I had in mind," he said, his voice wrought with emotion. "I'm not sure if you'll like the new design concept, but it felt like something was missing without them here. This was the diner they started together. They are the heart of this place." I nodded, my hand finally dropping from my mouth. "That's so true," I said, glad that he was finally starting to understand how special this diner was. He took a step toward me. "This might be a good personal touch for attracting customers as well as attracting buyers," he said, making me realize he'd learned nothing at all. "Buyers?" I said, shocked that he could even think of selling this place now. "The right buyer," he said, his voice choking a little on the last word. "You know, people who like this kind of sentimental stuff." "Yeah," I said, my voice thick with emotion as I managed to nod. "People do like this kind of stuff." He stood by in silence for a few awkward moments before he cleared his throat. "Can I show all of the photos to you?" "I'd love to see them," I said, blinking rapidly. He held out his elbow for me, and although my fingers had been shaking slightly, I rested them on his forearm. He guided me toward the blown-up wedding photo, the first of many photos, all of his lovely grandparents. A second family for me. A source of love and inspiration. Two of the most wonderful humans to have ever lived. To have ever loved. "I know the frame probably isn't right for the color of the walls," Spencer said, as I leaned closer to see Mr. and Mrs. Black laughing on a beach. Young, happy, and clearly in love. "We could switch the frames out easily enough," I said, wondering how he could create something so wonderful and still want to get rid of it. He guided me further along, his steady arm feeling like a source of comfort, since we shared a lot of memories with his grandparents. Seeing all these photos felt like a second grieving process at losing them. It was pain and beauty, love and loss, but it felt like a healthy kind of processing. And there was Spencer, being here with me. "I'm sure you'll find a better way to display the photos," he said. "I think you've done a pretty good job," I croaked. We stopped in front of the Blacks' wedding photo. I remembered looking at that photo as a little girl. Mrs. Black had even let me try on her wedding dress. I had cried when I'd snagged it on a too-big-for-me heel, and she just laughed and made me peppermint tea. Spencer and I started talking about the restaurant, about potential buyers, about the present, but it was clear that neither he nor I were really talking about any of that. We were just trying to keep it together. Holding on to insignificant, unimportant things, because we were both too afraid to hold on to one another. We came upon a picture of the Blacks with a young Spencer and me, and with our eyes interlocked. I turned to look up at him with watery eyes, remembering him entering the diner yesterday with that big box. "This is why you were late yesterday," I said with a sniffle, as it all came together. "You had been gathering these photos from their house. This is what you had in the box. Isn't it?" Spencer bit his lip and nodded. The attic was a bit more packed with things than I expected. Time stopped while I was looking through everything. I didn't realize I was late. "I'm sorry, Tabs. Please know I didn't hurt you on purpose." Thanks, I said, nodding. Around all these pictures, it only felt like minutes ago that I was laying eyes on Spencer Black across the street for the very first time. I'm sorry that I overreacted yesterday. It's just that emotions get messed up when you start mixing the past with the present, he said, a gentle smile forming on his lips. I guess you could say that, I said, blushing as I tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. But this redesign looks incredible. The diner looks warm and homey, like a place you want to order a cup of soup and sit for a while. This looks perfect. And to think that I nearly ruined it. He brushed my cheek with his knuckles, taking me by surprise. You didn't ruin anything. My grandparents' love was stronger than any huffing and puffing you can stir up. I laughed. Is that so? I'm glad we're moving past what happened yesterday, he said, giving me a side glance. I knew I wasn't going to get any sleep last night after the way you left. That's why I decided to hang all the frames and let you see for yourself. My stomach knotted at the thought of him staying up all night. I'm really sorry I upset you. One corner of his mouth lifted. I have a way that we can both make it up to one another. Warning bells began to go off in my head, but I raised a curious eyebrow. What kind of a way? A date, he said. To decide on a new menu? I said, wondering where he was going with this. Or to pick out floor tiles? Or to interview a social media manager to spend time with you, he said, cutting me off. My eyes widened. A real date? His face sobered. Yes, a real date. With you and me? I asked. He grinned, leaning in conspiratorially, before glancing across the diner. I mean, Tina can come if you want. I followed his gaze to find Tina, Davis, and Timmy watching us from behind the counter. Oops. I hadn't realized we had an audience. I'd been too wrapped up in memories, and Spencer. I don't want to come, Tina said in a grouchy response before she turned the page of her magazine. I laughed, glancing up at Spencer. I'm not sure. I don't see how that solves any of our problems with the diner. It doesn't, he said, running his thumb over my cheek. It just gives us a chance to spend time together. You and me. On a real date, I said, my heart rate kicking up. He nodded. A real date. Butterflies danced in my belly. All right, Spencer. I'll go on a date with you. His face broke into a beaming smile, and he kissed me on the cheek. I laughed, pushing him away. Okay. Now that we have that settled, where are you taking me? He pressed his forehead to mine, his eyes sparkling. I know a place with a pretty nice view. A date with a view, I said quietly. I waited for the sirens to go off in my head, warning me this date was a very bad idea. We'd gone down this road before, and it hadn't ended well. But as I looked into those green eyes, something pulled at me, begging me to give him a second chance. Chapter 12. The city fell away beneath us, like the bottom of a sparkling wishing well. From 1,000 feet above the ground, the lights of the building looked like thousands of gold coins all lit up. I guess Spencer had told the truth that he'd take me on a date with a pretty nice view, but I just needed to get over my teeth rattling, my mind whirling, and my knees shaking in terror. You don't have to grip the seat so tightly, Spencer said through the headset intercom. I tightened my white-knuckle grip. Yes, I do. If we crash, it's not going to do any good to hold on like that, he said, chuckling at my death glare. Kidding, Tabs? Kidding. I squeezed the seat harder. That's not funny. You're safe, he said, patting my knee. I'm highly trained. We're not going to crash. I turned to face him, my eyes bulging. How in the world did you learn to fly this thing when this is how? He turned to me, his green eyes serious. How my parents died? Yes. I said, wondering how he could sit there so calmly. My parents are the exact reason I chose this career, he said. Of all the things that Spencer could have done with his life after leaving Sacramento that last time, I had never imagined him working as a search and rescue helicopter pilot. In fact, this was the last thing on earth I would have guessed that he'd do for a living. He should have picked a different career, something safe. Something on the ground. Something that didn't remind him day in and day out of the worst tragedy of his life. I just simply couldn't understand why he'd done it. Nor could I understand why I had done it. Agreed to get on board, agreed to let him strap me in with firm and certain hands, and agreed to let him take me higher, higher and higher above the dazzling city very far below us. There is a reason why I wanted to take you on a flight for our date, he said, his tone serious. For the longest time, I've wanted to explain to you what happened when I left. Well, you could have explained on the ground, you know, I said, taking a deep breath to gather some courage before glancing out the window at the view. Oh man. We were so high above the ground. I squeezed my eyes shut. I needed to bring you up here, he said, his tone sincere. I want you to see for yourself, because that's what I needed to see. You couldn't have just showed me a picture? I said, thinking this was the craziest date of my life. Well, I was afraid that wouldn't be good enough, he said, lifting my hand from the seat and squeezing it firmly. I know I ruined things between us. My heart made me want to say that wasn't true, but it really was. If it hadn't been for his grandparents' restaurant, I would have walked away the very moment I saw him. So I kept silent, and I kept my eyes closed. When my parents died, I blamed myself for the longest time, he said. I never told you this, but I was supposed to be on that helicopter tour with them in Hawaii. They had bought a ticket for me. I was supposed to be up there with them. My stomach coiled. You were. He squeezed my hand. We were 8 years old and you and I were obsessed with building card houses. Do you remember I had wanted to stay home with my grandparents that summer instead of going to Hawaii with my parents? That sounded vaguely familiar. I remember we had loved building those card houses. We'd gotten to 3 floors with 1 deck. Exactly. That's all I wanted to do. Well, I never told you this. Never told anyone this. But I faked not feeling well when the time for the helicopter tour came. I wanted to call you and build card houses together, even though we were apart. So I faked a little cough, faked a little scratchy throat, and my parents went up there without me. Chills rolled down my spine. I opened my eyes and lifted my horrified gaze to those green eyes. Spencer, we did build card houses while on the phone together. I remember that day. He nodded. I was on the phone with you when my parents died. Spencer, I said, intertwining my fingers with his. It wasn't just the pain of losing them that kept making me run away, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It was the guilt that I should have been there too. My entire body went numb. You would have died. If you hadn't called me to build card houses, then you wouldn't be here right now. I pushed the truth to the back of my mind, but it would always come back. So, even when we were together, the guilt would return, he said. My stomach dropped, and it had nothing to do with the incredible heights beneath me. I remembered Spencer returning from Hawaii, without his parents. I remembered being excited about his return and throwing my arms around him. And from the back of my mind, I remembered him flinching. All those other times he'd run away from home, he hadn't been running away from his grandparents. He'd been running away from me. My heart squeezed. Why didn't you tell me? He turned to face me, squeezing my hand. Because I loved you. I opened my mouth, but then closed it again. I knew what crushing guilt felt like, and it was the last thing I wanted you to experience. I didn't blame you, of course. But eventually I realized I shouldn't have blamed myself either. And yet I did. And I was afraid you would too. I did the only thing I could to protect you. You left, I said, stunned. It took a few times of leaving for it to stick, he said with a bitter laugh. Leaving you was more difficult than you will ever know. But one day, I managed to get far enough away. And you didn't come back, I said. I couldn't, he said, returning his gaze to the controls. We sat in silence for a while. And then he said, that's why I eventually went to flight school. To face my fears. To move past the hurt. To heal. I took control of the thing that had scared me most by learning everything there was to know. And then I turned something terrible into something good, in memory of my parents. That's amazing, Spencer. But I learned one thing most of all of that guilt was just a worthless feeling. There was nothing I could have done if I had been there with them. I just would have died too. I pulled his hand to my chest and held it over my heart. He returned the gesture by kissing the back of my hand gently. He had slayed his demons. I was so proud of the man he'd become. I would have understood if you had told me. I loved you so much, I said, before heat flooded my cheeks. Back then, I mean. His lip curved upward, and a line formed between his eyebrows in a sad smile that said so much. I turned away from him because his eyes were the same eyes I had loved, his lips were the same lips, and his crooked grin the same crooked grin. I cleared my throat and leaned over to fish something out of my purse. Since we're doing the whole apology thing, I said, my voice shaky as I passed over the gift. I want to make an apology gesture for blowing up at you the other day. When you didn't show up at the diner for the meeting, it reminded me of when you left that last time, and well, I guess I have some healing left to do myself. The gift was a wooden frame that I had made myself that would go well with the framed photos of Mr. and Mrs. Black hanging in the restaurant. I'd enjoyed woodworking until losing a competition in my hometown of Blue Moon Bay with Carrie. I'd given up that craft, just like everything else that I was certain wasn't my thing. But working with wood again had felt right. Making something special for someone special felt far better than winning any competition. Spencer was quiet as he looked down at the frame, brushing his fingers over the fine wood grain that I'd sanded until it was buttery smooth. This is beautiful, Tabs. I remember how much you loved woodworking. I made it thinking we could find a photo of your parents to hang in the diner, I said, noticing the muscles on his face twitch a little before his eyes glistened. I'm sure your grandparents would like them to be in the diner with them. I know I would. I can't believe you made this for me, he said, glancing over at me. I mean, if you don't like the idea, then I totally understand. Don't worry about hurting my feelings if you don't want. Spencer dipped his head and pressed his lips to my cheek, leaving me stunned. What was that for? I said, my skin tingling from where his lips had been. He grinned, before facing forward again. It's not safe for my passengers to worry. It's a pilot's job to keep everybody nice and calm. What a Spencer comment, always the jokester. But I didn't need him to say that he appreciated my gesture. I could see the emotions written all over his face. Grinning myself, I shoved his shoulder playfully and we both laughed. And then I thought happily, maybe being up this high and being a helicopter pilot wasn't my thing. But I was happy that Spencer had found his thing, because he deserved that joy and peace more than anyone, and I knew his parents would be smiling down at him. Chapter 13. I wouldn't say that I believed in signs. I mean, I trained as a crossing guard for a few weeks in Minneapolis one way too frigid winter, until my toes had practically fallen off. So I'd say that I believed in certain kinds of signs: stop, green, yellow, red, yield, children crossing, etc. And I volunteered once to learn sign language to help people with disabilities coming into a DMV I'd once worked at in Denver. And of course, I fully believed in store signs, like the kind hanging outside of my sister's shops in Blue Moon Bay and Sacramento, displaying Carrie's kaleidoscope. In the calligraphy I'd once learned when starting a card-making business had seemed like a good idea. But I didn't usually believe in the other kind of signs. You know, like when you wake up to a beautiful, bright blue sky and think, for that reason alone, that the day is going to be lovely, wonderful, and special. Or like when you pull into a random spot in the parking lot, only for someone handsome you know to pull in at that very same moment, directly across from you, making you think, just from meeting his eyes through the windshield, that you've somehow made it past a hurdle, cleared a thicket, and are now stronger. So not realistic. I definitely didn't believe in the kind of sign where he emerges from his car with 2 cups of coffee, one for you and one for him, and you laugh because there in your own cup holders are 2 cups of coffee from the same coffee place, one for you and one for him. Clearly, Courtney must have had a good laugh that we'd both picked up each other's favorites from her cart. Nor the kind of sign where you hear a song playing in a passing car that used to be your song and you both start humming it after the car passes. And you both smile. And then you both laugh. And you both start humming the song once more. Your song. No, no, and no. I couldn't say that I believed in those kinds of signs. Or at least, I shouldn't believe in them, because if you believed in the signs that seem to say good things are coming, you'd also have to believe in the signs that say not so good things are coming. But I wasn't thinking all of this through carefully enough as Spencer held open the door to the restaurant for me, balancing his 2 coffees while I balanced mine. I wasn't thinking of not so good things at all. Because this beautiful morning had nothing but good signs. Wonderful signs. Special signs. And I had honestly so stupidly believed in them. Maybe if I'd walked into the Decadent diner, with Spencer right behind me singing that song of ours, and had found the restaurant mostly empty, as usual, with spills on the floor, then I might have come back to reality and realized that the weather and a random song and parking lot coincidences had nothing to do with my future or fate or destiny. But that wasn't what happened, so I stood no chance of being realistic. No chance at all. Instead, Spencer and I walked into the Decadent diner and found a line of people waiting to be seated. We both stopped and stared in utter bewilderment because of the reason there was a line blocking our way in the first place. The restaurant was packed. Every booth was stuffed with patrons. Every bar stool was filled. Every table had guests filling the chairs. The 2 of us were standing there stunned. "I'll get your name in just a minute, dears." Tina hurried by with a frazzled look, throwing a half-smile our way before she did a double take. "Oh, it's you. How silly of me." I turned to Spencer. "Did Tina just call us dears?" He raised an eyebrow. Was Tina smiling? "And she wasn't just sitting behind the counter," I said, shaking my head. "She was hustling too," Spencer said, giving me a side glance. The moment his gaze locked with mine, we both smiled, and my belly did a little flip. He hadn't asked me out again since our date, but how could I not take that smile as a good sign? "Hey, Tabitha. Over here." "Huh?" I said, recognizing that voice and turning to find my sister, occupying a booth across the restaurant. "Carrie?" "Yes," she said, waving. "Coming," I said, tugging Spencer behind me as we made our way through the bustling and noisy diner toward my sister. Carrie's eyes darted between Spencer and me, so I let go of his hand, my cheeks heating as if I'd been caught. I hadn't updated her on our helicopter date, but I wasn't quite sure why I was stalling on telling her. Maybe because I wasn't exactly sure where I stood with Spencer. I mean, he hadn't even kissed me goodnight. "Nice to see you, Spencer," Carrie said, grinning at me in a knowing way. "Long time no see," he said. Carrie raised an eyebrow. "Yes, well, we all know the reason for that." Oh, she had gone into big sister mode. I needed to change the subject to avoid an inquisition. "What are you doing here?" I said, noticing Katie sitting across from Carrie. "She came into my flower shop to purchase a bouquet for her shop," Katie said, twirling a French fry on her plate. "We started talking and I found out she's your sister." I told Katie I was hungry, Carrie said, holding her mug of coffee with two hands. Turns out she'd skipped lunch, so we decided to come over here. She said the food is delicious. Really? I said, feeling surprised because I'd never seen Katie in here. I happened to drop in yesterday, Katie said, in a tone as if to bring me up to speed. I tried one of Davis's new chocolate and orange cinnamon rolls while I was grabbing a cup of coffee from Courtney, who was here training Timmy on the espresso machine. Did someone call my name? Courtney said, coming over. Katie waved. I was telling Tabitha about yesterday, she said. Courtney flopped her arm over my shoulder. I thought Katie was going to fall right out of her bar stool after trying Davis's chocolate and orange cinnamon rolls yesterday, she said. Katie laughed. Not an exaggeration, either. I had to tell everyone I knew about them. That roll was that delicious. And unique. So I posted a photo of it on my social media and, as you can see, the word kind of got around. Flowers have long-reaching roots, I guess. Carrie laughed. I'm taking some back to Blue Moon Bay for my friend Anna. She and her husband Peter are expecting their first child, and she's been having the biggest sugar cravings. I know she'll appreciate these delicious rolls. Tell Anna I said congratulations, I said, still amazed at the crowd in here. Every single thing in my life seemed to be looking up. The restaurant was going to be a success. I had definitely found my thing. Spencer would hopefully change his mind about selling the diner and decide to run it with me. He and I might even get married, buy a house. Wow, I was getting way too ahead of myself. After all, we'd only had one date, but that kiss he'd given me on the cheek still made my heart race. Suddenly, Spencer threw his hands in the air. Here's the man of the hour. I turned to see Davis emerging from the kitchen with Courtney's new beau, Curtis, beside him. You should all be thanking this guy. It was his great-grandmother's recipe, and he shared it with me. Thank you, pal. It's a big hit. We owe you a debt of gratitude. I'm happy to help, Curtis said, his skin looking a little pale. He was wringing a towel in his trembling hands. Who knew that Curtis is a baker and a cook? Davis said, scratching the back of his head. He's going to cover for me the next couple weeks so I can finally take a vacation. Spencer and I exchanged a glance, knowing nothing of Davis's vacation or his replacement. At the same time, we shrugged. Curtis had made the business take off, so I couldn't exactly complain. Well, it had taken off with Katie's fantastic social media advertising. Curtis wiped the sweat off his brow and seemed out of sorts. I frowned at him in concern, but he only had eyes for Courtney. I'm sorry, everyone, he said, his voice shaky. I'd planned to wait until tonight. But I have to do this right now. I simply can't wait any longer. I stepped back with wide eyes as Curtis passed by me, took Courtney's hand in his own, and then dropped down on one knee. My hand flew to my mouth. Was he going to do what I thought he was going to do? Courtney Carmichael, Curtis said, as the buzz in the Decadent diner immediately faded until there was no sound but Courtney's tiny gasp as she put a hand over her heart. I know our time together has been short since I moved into the place next door to you. But days and hours and minutes are ridiculous to count when we could be counting our laughter, our joy, and the impact you've had on my life, in my heart and in my soul. Curtis, what are you doing? Courtney said, sounding like she was ready to scold him. I clasped my hands in front of me, watching Courtney's cheeks turn red as she stared at the man on his knee in front of her. This was so romantic. I couldn't help thinking this was a sign that my future with Spencer would follow the same path. When had I become such a sap? Love must do that to a person. Wait, love? Did I love Spencer? Had I ever stopped? Before you came into my life is a distant memory, Curtis said, interrupting my thoughts as his voice gained confidence and volume. Back then I was lifeless. I was uninspired. willing to argue with my beautiful neighbor over a fence until we found a solution together. Curtis, we've both been hurt in the past, but knowing you has changed my outlook on life, he said, his tone filled with passion. Now, I'm excited for each day that I get to wake up and see you. You remind me of home. Courtney gasped again. You've lost your mind? No, sweetheart, I've found my heart, he said, staring into her eyes which seemed to make her melt because she whimpered a little. You're the one who inspired me to find my great-grandma's old recipes and start baking again. I am, she said, looking more than a little shocked. I'm baking and cooking again because of you, he said, looking around at everyone. I've come out of retirement for this great side gig working at the diner because of this amazing woman. I glanced up at Spencer, who shrugged. Apparently, we had a new part-time employee. The success of the cinnamon roll here is because of you, Curtis said, turning back to Courtney and pulling out a ring from his pocket. Everything is for you. I see you looking at me like I've lost my mind, but I must listen to my heart. I must do this. Courtney was stunned silent. We were all stunned silent. Curtis took a big breath. Courtney Carmichael, I love you. I want to tie myself to you and spend every day together until death do us part. Will you marry me? I placed a hand over my mouth to cover my smile. Courtney, our beloved Courtney, who had helped so many of my friends find true love, was now finally finding love herself. I couldn't be happier for them. Spencer laced his fingers through mine and smiled down at me. This was definitely a sign that he and I would be next. I can't, Courtney said simply, her bottom lip trembling. Then she ran toward the door, squeezing between guests until she made her way outside, leaving Curtis still down on one knee, looking heartbroken. There was the problem with believing in good signs, because it meant you had to believe in the bad ones, too. And if that wasn't a bad sign right here, then I didn't know anything at all. I pulled my hand away. Spencer didn't stop me. And that was a bad sign, too. Good thing I didn't believe in those kinds of signs. Except, I actually kind of did. Chapter 14. After Courtney rejected Curtis last week, the tower of feelings I had rebuilt for Spencer had come crashing down like a ton of bricks. Love could not be trusted. I would not be blindsided like Curtis and left heartbroken, the same way I'd been blindsided years ago. When Spencer and I arrived to work at the exact same time that next morning, I made a point of parking as far away from him as possible. And I'd stayed clear of him since. But today, a week later, I screeched my car to a halt as we both tried for the same space. I frowned, even though he probably hadn't meant to take my parking spot on purpose. But I'd foolishly opened my heart to him again, and watching the end of Courtney's romance had been a reality check. Someone always left. I sympathized with poor Curtis. Gripping my wheel with one hand, I waved at Spencer with the other, ushering him to back out of the spot that I'd found first. He gave me a weird look before driving to a different parking space. When we arrived at the front door to the diner, I realized I'd forgotten my key. I nodded toward the lock, and Spencer also nodded toward the door. The key? I said, crossing my arms over my chest. I forgot mine, he said with a little shrug. Let's use yours. You seriously don't have the key? I said, blowing out a breath. Just another confirmation that I couldn't rely on him. I didn't bring mine either. He raised an eyebrow. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said, knowing that forgetting our keys shouldn't have been a big deal. But it felt like he'd locked us out on purpose, because he didn't care enough. I gave Katie a spare, I said, since I always had to be the reliable one. We'll have to get it from her. After you, he said, waving a hand. Sucking in a deep breath, I walked over to Gold Rush Flowers for the spare key. But when we stopped in front of her flower shop, the sign posted on the window said, "Apologies. Closed for personal reasons today. Back tomorrow with flowers and smiles." Katie. Great, now we're going to open late today, I said, thinking of all the things I needed to do at the diner. Spencer insisted on going back home for his key, and I insisted on going back home for mine because I didn't want to depend on him for anything. I left feeling frustrated and didn't even try to talk to him about it. I knew this was bound to happen, that we would fall apart. Talking about it wasn't going to do anything but prolong the inevitable. On the way back to the restaurant, I hit traffic and Spencer got a flat tire, so the Decadent diner opened very late since Davis hadn't given Curtis a key, and neither Tina nor Timmy had one either. I returned to a crowd of grumbling customers outside the restaurant. Things only got worse once I let them inside. Curtis's cinnamon rolls were still the buzz around town, bringing in more people every day. One glance back at the kitchen through the window in the front told me all I needed to know. Curtis and Courtney hadn't patched things up. Curtis was moving around the kitchen with the speed of molasses, stirring batter as if it was concrete in the bowl, and ignoring the beeping of the oven like he'd simply lost his hearing. "Crisis at table 4, Spencer said, interrupting my thoughts as he approached with 2 plates of barely touched cinnamon rolls. "What's wrong?" I said, eyeing the plates. "The customers claim the cinnamon rolls are dry and crumbly," Spencer said, before nodding toward the clearly unhappy people in the corner booth. "Can you handle their refund?" "Sure," I said, thinking I always handled the baggage in our relationship, so why not the problematic cinnamon rolls? When I went to make nice with the customers, they pushed their coffee cups to the end of the table. "No good either?" I asked. "Can't you smell it?" the man said. "Burnt through and through." "I'll get you fresh coffees right away," I said, taking the cups, which were still so full that they spilled over my fingers and dripped onto the floors, making me feel like Timmy. I backed away, and the 2 guests decided to leave. Well, more like flee. Spinning around and looking at the rest of the restaurant, I saw more unhappy patrons. People scowling at their steaming cups, picking at dry strips of cinnamon roll, and people grabbing their bags and leaving, mumbling comments like, "Never again." I went to the espresso machine, surprised to find Courtney standing there. Wait, it hadn't been Curtis who had burned their coffee. It had been Courtney. How was that even possible? I'd been drinking her coffee for over a year, and she had always made it so perfectly that I wanted to savor every sip. "Are you okay, Courtney?" I said, setting the mugs down and then patting her shoulder. "I'm sorry, Tabitha," she said, glancing toward the kitchen. "It's just that every time I see him, I remember how he went down on his knee and how I said." "It's all right, you don't have to explain," I said, not wanting to hear the details of why Curtis hadn't been enough for her. It had triggered my heartbreak from when Spencer's rejected me before. I was worried about her, though. I mean, the woman made the best coffee in the world. For her to mess up this badly meant she was clearly not okay. "It's..." A scream from one of the few remaining occupied booths drew my attention. One glance in that direction told me all I needed to know. Timmy had left the paint out from the advertising signs he'd been making the night before. The bright yellow paint had spilled. I went from one disaster to another the whole day long, running myself ragged and never seeming to make anything go right. My hair was a mess. There were stains all over my apron and makeup smudged around my eyes, but I kept trying so hard. And the worst part of it all? When I felt so exhausted that I needed a shoulder to lean on at the end of the day, I looked for Spencer, but he was gone. I hadn't seen him leave, and he hadn't said anything to me. But then again, I never saw him before he decided to skedaddle last time either. When I locked the Decadent diner's doors for the night, I turned toward the kitchen and saw Curtis sniffling. I dug my palms into my eye sockets and forced back a frustrated groan before walking over to where he dropped onto the floor next to a big burlap sack of potatoes. "It will be okay, Curtis," I said, trying to stay positive as he sighed and glanced up at the ceiling as though it had forsaken him. Baking something will surely make you feel better. Nothing will make me feel better, he said. I'm sorry, I said, feeling his pain. Today had been a bad day, for sure. I felt certain that if I could get Curtis to bake a new batch of his cinnamon rolls, then we could turn things around tomorrow. I'd make sure to keep an eye on Courtney, so the coffee didn't burn. I'd make sure there was no paint left out. I'd follow Timmy around with a mop and a roll of paper towels to ensure that the floors remained spotless. If it came to it, I was ready to stab Tina's magazines with a fishing hook and lure her out from behind the counter. Despite the setbacks, I couldn't give up on the restaurant the Blacks had left to me. Normally, I would have given up on this potential career by now. My bags would have been packed for something new to try, my plane ticket would have been booked, and my taxi waiting outside. But tonight, I threw some things into a bowl until one was elbow deep in sticky dough. Cheeks covered in flour. Feet aching, eyes stinging, and back hurting. Bound and determined to get a heartbroken chef to step away from his sack of potatoes and help. So far, it wasn't going well. The scent of those cinnamon rolls is killing me slowly, Curtis said, throwing his hands into the air. How can I ever bake again without thinking of her? I tried to pull some of the tacky dough off my fingers. Did it need more water? Less? I was lost. Absolutely lost. I needed Curtis. But Curtis needed Courtney. You know, Curtis, I said, trying to figure out how to say this as gently as possible. You did bake before Cower, ahem before her. And it made you happy at one point in your life. Worse. I definitely made things worse. Much worse. No, he cried, tears leaking from his eyes and rolling down his cheeks. No, what I did before her was not baking. It was following instructions. It was mixing things in a bowl. It was waiting around for a beep to say things were done. It meant little until her. She was my muse. Well, I said, wincing as he paused to blow his nose on his apron. That sounds like a start. Why don't we try following the instructions? Just mix ingredients in a bowl. Because Davis is out of town and relying on you. We're all relying on you. A lot of people have come in to taste your delicious cinnamon rolls. That has to make you a little happy, right? No, he said, shaking his head. What is singing without joy but merely making noise? What is gardening without hope, but just getting your fingers dirty? What is life without love, but going from one place to the next? Oh, my sweet Courtney. Why did she end things? I watched in horror, stirring the bowl of very hard dough, as Curtis buried his face in his hands and fresh tears flowed unencumbered. I shifted awkwardly from foot to foot. The orange zest, I said, mumbling to myself. Do I squeeze the orange or grate the peel? And then rub it somewhere? She was my orange zest, he said, staring blankly at me. Why couldn't she say yes and enjoy her life with me? Everything was good between us. I don't know why people have a hard time committing, I said, honestly. I looked back at the bowl in front of me and sighed. All we can do is move on, put one foot in front of the other. Or one stir in front of the other, as the case may be. I was about to dump out the dough to try again when I heard the front door of the restaurant open. The lights in the main dining room switched on, and Curtis looked up with hopeful, tear-streaked eyes. Courtney, he said. I craned my neck to see who had come in. No, it's Spencer. Spencer and shush. Get down, so he doesn't see us. I'm already down, Curtis said, as I ducked down beside him. Hush, I said, squeezing the bowl against my chest. He's with someone. Curtis sniffled, and then was quiet. I craned my ear to try and hear. The man I'd seen come in with Spencer wore a fancy suit. He had a notepad out and a camera around his neck. My mind instantly went to the obvious explanation, and what Spencer said seemed to confirm it. This is the place, Spencer said as I hid just out of sight. I mean, you're the expert at this kind of stuff, but I can suggest a few angles after I show you around. With a finger to my lips, I dragged Curtis away from the potato sack and toward the back door, opening it slowly so it didn't make any noise. "Who was that with Spencer?" Curtis said, once we were in the dark back alley. I shook my head, one hand holding the bowl and the other hand on my hip. "Who else?" I said, my jaw tightening. "Someone to help him sell the restaurant." "But," Curtis sniffled, shaking his head. "But I thought things were going well." Spencer seemed to be enjoying the diner. "I can't imagine him selling it." "I thought things were going well too," I said, turning to him. "I guess you and I both have been let down." I still can't believe it. Curtis let a few more tears fall before he bid me goodnight and walked to his car. I wasn't in the crying mood. I was in a hurt mood. And I must protect myself at all costs mood. So I set the bowl on the front passenger seat, drove home, and kept it together. It was only once I'd changed into my pajamas and climbed into bed that the tears began to flow. Chapter 15. The next day, Spencer wasn't even trying to hide the fact that he wanted to sell the restaurant at the end of the allotted 3 months. With his actions, there was no way I could try to pretend he was considering keeping the Decadent diner. After everything we'd been through, he still had no sentimental attachment to this restaurant that his grandparents had left to us. Unbelievable. For him, there was only the money he'd receive from the sale, and then he'd be gone again. I suppose that was his choice, but he could at least pretend to care a little. "Hey Tabs," he said, standing in the center of the dining room staring up at the ceiling. "What do you think about this new light fixture I just installed?" I turned away from him, having no interest in helping him update the place in order to make an easier sale. I moved behind the counter next to Tina and her magazines and blew out a breath. Without acknowledging me, she flipped the page. "Can you believe him?" I said, sliding closer to her, which earned me a scowl. If he wants to change the light fixtures to impress his real estate agent, he should do it after hours. He doesn't have to throw it in our faces in broad daylight. Tina responded with a gruff sound, keeping her eyes on the page of her magazine. "I mean, there are customers in here, and he's performing a remodel," I said, gesturing around the restaurant, which was pretty empty. "Totally unprofessional." "If you say so," Tina said, flipping another page. Technically, there was only the elderly couple who had become regulars after that day I dragged Courtney in here to make them coffee. They sipped at their probably scorched coffees with polite smiles and eyed the door as if considering an escape. Besides those two, the place was empty. Our boom from Katie's social media posts had been short-lived, thanks to dry cinnamon rolls and burnt coffees. Sigh. "I mean, there could be more customers coming in at any time," I said, leaning close to Tina, who moved further away from me. "What kind of assurance does it give them of our longevity if Spencer is standing there, hollering about light fixtures?" Tina licked her finger and flipped the page without glancing at me or saying anything else. "Yeah, thanks for the support." "Not Tabs," Spencer said, stepping up onto a chair and squinting at the bulbs in an outdated shade. "How do you think the new lights compare to this one?" I walked over and stood beneath him, crossing my arms. "I think there's nothing wrong with the original lights. What's strange is that you've suddenly decided to change them. I thought you'd be happy." Spencer's mouth stretched out into an amused grin as he ducked down from the light to gaze at me. He seemed surprised by my annoyed posture, but hopped down from the chair and patted off his dusty hands. "You thought wrong," I said, wishing his smile wasn't so enticing. "Let me show you something else I'm considering," he said, leading me away with his hand on the small of my waist. "Fine," I said, brushing his hand away. He eyed me curiously, and then gestured toward the photo booth. "I've been thinking about this old thing. The more I've thought about it, the more I think It won't add anything to the resale value of the restaurant, I said, remembering the feel of him next to me when we'd been squished in there together. I also remembered how I'd wanted him to kiss me. My heart skipped a beat at the thought. I agree with you. No one wants their picture taken in one of those old things anymore. Not with cell phone cameras now. It's a waste of space where another booth could go. Spencer stopped beside me as I continued to assess the old, faded velvet curtain that I loved, but that he must have seen as a profit loss. When I glanced over at him, he wore a bewildered look on his face. He was probably surprised that I wasn't trying to talk him into keeping the diner anymore. Well, it was all too late for that, wasn't it? I'd been dreaming, and now I was all about facing the cold, hard facts, just like poor Curtis had to do. I wouldn't say it's a waste. While we're on the subject, the pictures should come down, I said, gesturing to all of the warm, beautifully framed photos that hung on the walls. I waved a hand at them, stalking past him briskly. A prospective buyer needs to see a clean slate to be able to visualize their own business goals. These clearly represent the past and not the future. Don't they? Spencer walked toward me. Tabitha. I knew I'd melt from the warmth of his touch and the smell of his cologne, so I moved away before he could reach me. The kitchen is obviously outdated, I said, crossing my arms. But the new owner should fix it up the way they want it. No point in putting in new equipment when we have no idea what configuration would work best for whoever ends up in here. I had made a mistake in going toward the kitchen, because in the back hallway before the swinging door, Spencer was able to step in front of me and block my exit. He cornered me with a hand on the doorframe and lowered his head. What exactly are you trying to tell me? I felt tears burn the backs of my eyes. Stupid tears. Silly tears. The tears of a young girl left by the one she loved, without understanding and without the chance to say goodbye. I'm saying exactly what you've tried to tell me since day one, I said, blinking the tears back and lifting my chin. It would be best if we sell the Decadent diner. We don't have much time left in the 3 months your grandparents required, so then we can sell the place. Spencer had the audacity to look shocked. What the? You want to sell? He said, lowering his voice to whisper, and then glancing over his shoulder at the staff in the main part of the restaurant. Tabs. I crossed my arms. Don't call me that, please. Tabitha, he said, inhaling deeply. Where is this coming from? I bit my bottom lip. I accepted a job in New York. A line formed between his eyebrows. You did what? When? Why? This wasn't working, and I finally accepted it, I said with a shrug. I start next week. Next week, he asked, his chin dropping a little. Tabs. Tabitha, I said, shaking my head. How many times do I have to say it? Tabitha, he said, dropping his hand from the doorframe and reaching for me. Why would you take another job? You love this diner. I know you do. I stared him straight in the eye. Because I'm not going to stay around here, hoping anymore. I'm not going to be the one who gets left this time. I'm going to live my life on my terms, without trying to talk someone into keeping what they don't want. Now that his arm was not blocking my escape, I turned on my heel and hurried away. Tabs, wait. I didn't stop though. I couldn't listen to whatever he might say because I didn't want to change my mind. I thought of that look on Curtis's face when Courtney had rejected him. That would not be me this time. I hurried past Timmy, who dropped a trayful of glasses. Ironically, the sound made a wave of nostalgia waft over me. I went past Tina, who sighed over one of her magazines. Then I moved past Curtis, who set a limp-looking salad across the serving window. I heard Spencer's feet moving on the old checkered floor behind me, but I was already pushing the door open, already wincing against the last rays of the setting sun. I'd really tried my best to make the Black's restaurant my thing. I tried to give love another chance. Tried to make a home for myself in Sacramento. But if something wasn't going to work out anyway, then I just needed to accept that and move on. I had to hope that I'd find my thing eventually, and that I'd find my person too. Chapter 16. Nothing was going to stop me from moving forward with my life. Not the flashing gaslight that seemed to know I barely had enough room on my credit card for the gas I'd need for this across-the-country drive. Not the tires that strained under the weight of the belongings from my apartment that were packed up, tacked up, squeezed, swished, and tied down in and on every available space of the car. Not the old interstate map with scribbled on pages from all the other trips I'd taken trying to find my thing. I hadn't found it in Sacramento. It certainly didn't help that Spencer's name kept popping up on my cell phone screen as my phone buzzed from the seat beside me. Just one last stop and then I was out of here. Out of Sacramento. Out of the Decadent diner. Out of Spencer's life. Out before he beat me to it. Out before he could leave, like he was always going to do. Out before I would be left alone in an empty restaurant filled with crushed dreams. This would be a pit stop, really. In and out. I drove a lap around the parking lot of the Gold Rush shopping center to make sure Spencer's car wasn't here. It wasn't, thank goodness. I'm sure he had packing to do himself before he sold the place, and I was glad not to be around to watch. It would have torn me apart to see his beloved grandparents' diner sold to the highest bidder. It was hard not to answer his phone call. I didn't want to hear his voice or I might cave, go back and get my heart ripped to shreds. What did he want, though? Probably just business to conclude, but he could mail whatever he needed me to sign through Frank Fields, the romance-reading attorney. I'd rather go through Frank than hear Spencer let me down easy, or tell me it had been nice catching up. Maybe he would encourage me to keep the restaurant for myself, as if I could afford it, but he didn't want the diner, or me. Well, there was no way I was answering and getting rejected, no matter how many times he redialed. I'd also deleted 5 unlistened to voicemails from him, but who's counting? I parked, turned off the car, and then did something I should have done right away. I blocked Spencer's phone number. My heart pinched as I tapped the final button, but it was for the best. Now I just needed to get flowers, visit the Blacks' graves one last time, and then bolt out of town. When I entered Gold Rush Flowers, I found the front desk empty. I was about to ring the bell when I heard voices from the back. Hushed voices. Serious voices. Voices I recognized, Katie and Courtney. It was obvious they were having an intimate conversation, and I tried to keep my ears from straining to hear as I noisily selected a bouquet from the refrigerated section and flopped the bouquet on the counter. But they didn't seem to hear me, just like they hadn't heard the front door open. Clearing my throat didn't do the trick either. I heard Courtney sniffle and then blow her nose. I don't know. I just panicked. It was all so sudden. Our relationship was going great, and then he was down on one knee. It was rather fast, Katie said, and I heard her plucking a tissue from a box. It's strange because I love watching people find their happy endings, Courtney said between bouts of blowing her nose. But my life has fallen apart before. Big time. What if this relationship does that to me again? Taking a chance with him scares you, Katie said. Long pause. More like terrifies me. I felt a pang in my heart as I heard strong, wonderful Courtney begin to cry. I'd seen Curtis cry quite a bit over the past few days, but not Courtney. She was tough, upbeat, and always there for everyone else. I wondered if I should join them and give her a hug. After a moment, Katie said, "The other day was the anniversary of my husband's death." "Oh, Katie," Courtney said. I was stunned. I never knew Katie had been married, let alone that her husband had passed away. I felt guilty when I remembered the flower shop was closed recently when Spencer and I had needed the spare key. I should have checked on her. We'd known it was coming for a while, she said, letting out a long breath. But at the start, I didn't know how to deal with knowing the end was near. The certainty that he would be leaving me. I was so worried and so heartbroken. And of course, I was afraid. I was terrified even. My response was to want to do everything for him. I ran myself ragged. I'm really sorry, Courtney said, echoing the words of my own heart. Thanks, Katie said, pausing for a moment. And maybe I would have continued going full speed up until his death, but one day my husband told me we needed to talk. He told me not to steal time that didn't need stealing. What he meant, he explained, was that I had these precious moments to love and to be loved. They were limited, but they were always going to be limited. It's that way for all of us. But when you hold yourself back from feeling and experiencing love, you're taking that finite time and making it even smaller. What did you do? Courtney said. Katie blew out a breath. I spent the rest of our time together loving him and letting him love me. Letting him love me until the very end. My eyes burned. I decided to go, after leaving the last of my cash on the counter. My heart broke for her. But her husband hadn't wanted to leave her, whereas Spencer had chosen to leave. I loved him. I wanted us to be together, but I couldn't make him stay. I didn't have that kind of control over anyone else, and if I remained here any longer, I might have been tempted to stay in Sacramento. To really consider Katie's words, her story. To put my fear aside. It was easier to run. Easier to get in my car and chase another thing. Easier to put miles between me and the Decadent diner, and miles between Spencer and me. Easier to not face the pain at the end than to be loved for a short time. And so I left. After living in Poughkeepsie for nearly 2 months, I learned without a doubt that condo staging was not my thing. Yes, I had taken the job rather hastily. But the real estate agent who had hired me seemed nice, and I hoped it would work out. After my time at the Decadent diner, I thought I might enjoy making other spaces look nice. I did have an artistic background with woodworking and helping out at my sister's quirky crafts shop. I figured that staging might take those talents to a whole new level. Arranging furniture here. Putting up art there. Creating a cozy, friendly, warm atmosphere for prospective renters and buyers could see themselves kicking off their shoes there after a long day of work. See themselves relaxing into a comfortable chair with a slice of pie, a newspaper, and a good song on the jukebox. I mean, radio. See themselves waking up to a piping hot cup of coffee just the way they liked it, greeting a smiling face who cared about their day, ordering a plate of eggs and bacon and a special cinnamon roll, and seeing the server sitting on her favorite bar stool reading a magazine. I shook my head to clear my thoughts that had clearly drifted. But on the final day of the 3 months required before selling the Decadent diner, I found myself sitting in a room that was staged and feeling like I was living in a life that was staged. None of it was real. The pillows I fluffed were new and not used and loved. The couch might as well have been made of cardboard for how uncomfortable it was, although it did look very nice. Even the smell of fresh cookies from the kitchen was just a slyly placed diffuser. It was all fake. It was all temporary. It was all just for show. And that was how I felt, like a cardboard girl in a cardboard world. I had to keep telling myself that this was better than having been left again. Better than watching the Decadent diner be sold off. At least I didn't have my heart broken, right? All I felt was numb. I left work for the day and did what I always did. I went home. Grabbed the mail. Poured a cup of hot tea. I was leafing through the mail, which was the usual junk ads, and then I spotted something different. A letter from Carrie. This was surprising, because Carrie had never written a letter to me before. Oh, sure, she had texted and emailed. She'd sent me care packages from the shop, hand-knitted tea kettle warmers, little soaps in the shape of leaves and pine cones, and enough rock candy to make my dentist's head explode. We also talked on the phone often, but she had never written me a letter. It had to be bad news. With a twinge of worry, I opened the simple white envelope. As it turned out, Carrie still wasn't much of one for the written word. The sticky note from her only said, "Read this, please." It was stuck on an attached newspaper clipping, with an article containing considerably more words. My eyebrows knitted together as I took a sip of tea and glanced at the headline, "Love and Cinnamon Rolls from the 50s. The Decadent Diner wants to give you a new taste of the old." "The Decadent Diner," I said, tears filling my eyes as I sank into the only chair in my place and began to read. When I enter the restaurant a final time after its complete renovation, it's not the new state-of-the-art kitchen that co-owner Spencer Black wants to show me. It's not the snazzy interior, done up in 50s style. And it's not even the signature chocolate and orange cinnamon roll, steaming deliciously on a plate at the counter beside a perfect cup of joe. No, he takes the plate to a booth at the back of the restaurant and sets it on the table. The tabletop is conspicuous, seeming to be the only one in the restaurant that hasn't been replaced. The booth is a little dingy, the leather torn in places and faded in others. The table is battered, stained, and slightly crooked. But it's here that Mr. Black insists I sit, and he slips into the booth across from me, smiling. He points to a picture above the booth, encased in a beautiful wooden frame that he tells me was handmade by his first love. When I asked if they are still together, he shakes his head and tells me he blew it with her. Inside that lovely frame is a picture of his parents. In the frame to the right of the photo is a black and white photo of a young couple, who are leaning over a booth kissing. Mr. Black tells me the young couple is his grandparents, and this is the same booth where that photo was taken. In fact, their initials are carved in the corner. He said it was love at first sight when his grandfather saw his grandmother, and even though he was shy, he approached her and said, "May I join you?" And she said, "You bet, handsome." And they were inseparable from that moment on, even passing away just days apart earlier this year. Over that aforementioned cup of joe and cinnamon roll, each bite and sip more delicious than the last, Mr. Black tells me that he made a very big mistake of running away from his first love. He says that his grandparents knew of this mistake and at their death set about to remedy his mistake by playing matchmaker. To do this, the Blacks left the Decadent Diner to both Mr. Black and to his first love, reuniting them after a decade apart. "I think they knew what I didn't at the time," Mr. Black tells me, smiling at the picture of his grandparents. "That she was the only love I would ever have, and that my heart would never belong to anyone but her." Well, where is this great love? I say, asking the question of the day. His answer was this: I blew it again. I initially thought I'd sell the restaurant, and that upset her. She loved this diner. I frown and say, "What made you decide not to sell?" He smiles and says, "After coming to the diner day after day, meeting with her to fix the place up, I realized I want to be with her every day for the rest of my life." He looks melancholy. I admittedly feel disappointed as well. Sorry it didn't work out. Me too. He pauses, a mix of emotions crossing his face. I'm not good with emotions. I should have told her how much I still love her while I had the chance. Somehow, I stupidly thought she knew. And I wanted to surprise her with keeping the restaurant. I had an entire proposal prepared in my mind, but her sister says I'm an idiot. She says I should have reassured her, not surprised her after all I'd done to hurt her before. That woman is not one to mince words. Although I was choked up, I let out a little laugh, because that was so true about Carrie. She's right to feel upset with me for hurting her sister. I've left voicemails and written numerous emails apologizing. I even sent flowers, thanks to the wonderful florist next door, who has her address. But she's not responding. It might be over, and that terrifies me. But this time, I'm not running away from what scares me. This time, I'm waiting for her. I'll wait for her, right here in this diner, until my dying day, even if she never comes back. Because she loved this restaurant, and everything about it reminds me of her. Come find love yourself at the Decadent Diner's grand reopening party this Saturday night. All are welcome. Guests are encouraged to dress in 50s style. I brushed my thumb over the photo of the booth, sliding my fingers over the photo of the blacks hanging over the booth in the picture frame I'd given Spencer on that helicopter ride. Spencer had finished the remodel and had decided to keep the restaurant. Spencer wasn't running away. He was waiting for me. My eyes watered as I played with the paper, bending it back and forth with my fingers as I processed this article and what it meant. Then, half distractedly, half led by what you could call a sign, I guess, I bent the paper back and looked down at the face of the author next to the byline. The photo showed that the writer was the same man Spencer had brought into the restaurant that night I'd spied on him from the kitchen. The one I had thought was a real estate agent. The irony that I'd been scared and had run was not lost on me. What emotion did I feel the most right now? Was it guilt? Was it frustration? Was it sadness at more time lost with my love? All of the above. I was determined not to waste another minute. So I sent a text to my sister, thanking her for the article and telling her I was coming home. Chapter 17. I drove toward the Decadent Diner's grand reopening party, purchasing items to make a 50s-themed outfit along the way. My skirt was a fluffy, swingy, bright pink hopscotch number I picked up from a thrift shop in Ohio. My white and mint green polka dot blouse with a silk tie at the neck was something I happened upon at a flea market in Iowa. The pink-lensed cat-eye style sunglasses I nabbed from a gas station in Nebraska. I curled my hair in a pit stop Utah restroom, which transitioned into the windswept look in Nevada thanks to rolling my window down. I dropped into a boutique in Tahoe and found the perfect black and white loafers to complete my look. I hadn't signed any paperwork, so I knew I was still a co-owner of the Decadent Diner. In the newspaper article, Spencer had said he would wait for me. I hoped that meant I would have a decadent date for this evening as well. My heart pounded in my chest. I would soon find out. I sent an RSVP to the online personal invitation, which meant Spencer had to know I was coming. I didn't want to hash things out with him over the phone or via text or email, shudder, and wrapping up my work commitments and packing all my belongings had taken every spare day prior to this big night, so I couldn't arrive in town even a day earlier. I did my makeup in the rearview mirror at stoplights until I hit I-80 West and had to pay attention to the road in front of me. As I drove to Sacramento, I thought about the various places I'd been in my life and all of the places I'd searched for my thing. I'd searched and had come up empty time and time again, until the Decadent Diner. I pulled into the Gold Rush shopping center at sunset, arriving here in much the same way as I'd left, car full of my belongings and gaslight turned on. As I gathered my purse, I could hear my engine popping and hissing from its long journey home as people streamed by on either side of me. All of them headed toward the bright lights cast from a brand new sign, spelling the Decadent Diner. Getting out of the car was surprisingly hard. I'd come all this way, ready for my perfect career and to nab my guy, but what if something had changed for him? I had changed for sure. I had found my thing and confirmed that I didn't want to try any other thing ever again. I could afford to keep the restaurant if I had a partner, and I wanted that partner to be Spencer. But if he really didn't want to keep the diner, I'd have to look for a new partner. The mere thought of that felt like a knife to the heart. Spencer had changed too. He was no longer a person who would run. And yeah, I had run away this last time. But if I could forgive him for leaving the first time, then I had to hope he would give me a second chance as well. I got out of the car and could hear the music pumping from inside the diner. As I approached the front door, the sound of laughter and voices talking over one another and orders being called into the kitchen overwhelmed me. I inhaled the smell of what I knew was my past and what I hoped was my future, no matter how scary it might be to put down permanent roots: fresh, strong coffee, sizzling bacon, and cinnamon rolls. Yum! I reached for the door to the restaurant, which had to be packed at capacity if the full parking lot and loud party were any indication. But before I could grab the handle, the door swung toward me, pushed open by a familiar hand wearing a sparkly ring on her left ring finger. "Courtney!" I cried in shock. "Tabitha!" she exclaimed, taking hold of my arm, pulling me inside, and then embracing me in a massive hug that threatened to break my ribs. The gesture brought tears of joy to my eyes. "I missed you." "We've missed you a ridiculous amount," she said, releasing me and trying to peer into my eyes through my pink cat-eye-style sunglasses. "But you needed to get away. I understand the need for time and space. Believe me." "Thank you," I said, moving my sunglasses to sit on top of my head amid the mass of windswept curls. My gaze returned to her hand. "Courtney, you're engaged." Even though it should have been impossible for Curtis to hear us, given how loud the restaurant was and how many people were between him and us, he shouted, "I must be dreaming, Tabitha." She finally said yes. Courtney laughed. "If you're dreaming, honey, then I am too. I hope we never wake up." This earned cheers from people around us. I scanned the crowd, but none of the faces belonged to Spencer. He had to be here, though, since it was the grand reopening he'd planned. Had he heard Curtis shout my name? If so, he hadn't come over. Not a good sign. "Congratulations," I said, turning back to my friend, who wore a sleeveless button-down shirt and capris, both in a retro Hawaiian design. "What changed your mind about marrying Curtis?" "Turns out I was being a big baby," she whispered, leaning in close to me and slipping her arm through mine. "I made up all these reasons in my head to say no. Like that Curtis wouldn't love me forever, since my ex hadn't. Or that it was my place to help others find love, and not to have forever love myself. Total roadblocks. But then Katie shared with me about how her husband had passed away. Did you know she was a widow?" "I heard that," I said, my heart pinching as I decided I'd explain to them at a later date that I'd overheard their conversation that night I'd brought flowers to the Blacks' graves. "After talking with Katie about her loss, I didn't want to waste another moment being scared," she said, squeezing my arm. "We never know how much time we have with someone we love, and I didn't want to waste another minute being apart from him just because I was scared to take a second chance at marriage. I want to spend the rest of my life with Curtis, and I want that joy to start now." "I'm happy for you," I said, squeezing her back. "I know all about being afraid to take a second chance. I'll tell you a secret, Tabitha. Love will conquer the fear if you let it," she said, giving me a quick wink before pulling out her cell phone and typing something into it. "Now that you're here, let me show you some changes that have been made since you've been gone." "Actually, I need to find Spencer," I said, feeling both nervous and excited to see him. I didn't want to waste another day being apart from him, but the fact that I'd run out on him and blocked his calls meant that I had a lot of apologizing to do, which was not my strength and felt more than a little nerve-wracking. "He's busy right now," she said, waving a hand dismissively. All of the air left my lungs. He was too busy for me? This was not going to be the grand reunion at the grand reopening that I'd hoped. "Let me show you everything," Courtney said, pulling me from my thoughts. We squeezed our way around guests, and she showed me the changes. The diner had been transformed into everything I'd imagined it could be. It looked as if Spencer had taken all of the pie-in-the-sky impossible plans I'd drawn up that very first week and brought them to life. The changes had turned the diner into a combination of stepping back in time and a relaxed, comfortable vibe, as if stepping into your living room. I loved it. The old photo booth has been switched out with a restored one from the actual 50s. Here, I'll show you the inside, Courtney said, yanking the curtain open. We both gasped at the same time. Sitting inside the photo booth, squished in side by side, were Davis and Tina. And they were kissing. They pulled apart and gaped up at us. My chin dropped, and no words could be formed by my mouth. Well, hello there, boss, Tina said, looking annoyed as if we'd invaded their privacy on purpose. Some things have changed since Davis got back. Turns out she missed me when I was on my first vacation in decades, Davis said, chuckling. And I missed her too. I can see that, Courtney said, shaking her head as if someone had been naughty. Tina, you're supposed to be taking photos of the guests with that Polaroid camera Spencer gave you. Not necking with the cook in the photo booth. What can I say, she said, wrinkling her nose and turning back to him. I got used to having him around every day and need to make up for lost time. I know the feeling, Davis said, before leaning toward her again with his mouth puckered and... Courtney slammed the curtain shut. Oh my. Yeah, I said, wondering if employee dating was some kind of human resources violation. Although Davis had hired Curtis without my permission, so why shouldn't he date the server? What a wacky diner I owned, but I loved it. I guess Davis and Tina are an item now? Guess so, Courtney said with a shrug, and then we both burst out laughing. Didn't see that one coming. They are kind of cute, I said, with a smile now that I was recovering from the shock. I'm surprised he could get her away from the counter and her magazines. I certainly wasn't able to do that. Maybe it takes that special person, Courtney said, checking her cell phone and typing something into it. Moving on. We turned around and almost ran straight into my sister Carrie and her fiancé, Adrian, who were standing with Katie. Hey sis, I said, putting my hand over my heart. Suddenly, I pictured the article she'd sent, which was the reason I'd come back. My sister had always been there for me. She seemed willing to give Spencer a second chance because she cared about my happiness and knew before I did that I still loved him. It's about time you got here, she said, looking beautiful in a bright yellow cocktail dress and a colorful silk scarf worn over her head and tied under her chin. She gave me a hug. The drive went okay? It was long, but gave me a lot of time to think, I said, glancing over at Adrian, who wore suspenders and held a prop cigar. How's engaged life? Couldn't be better, he said, slipping his arm around Carrie's waist. I'm glad to hear it, I said, touching my messy curls. Thanks for coming to the grand reopening, Katie. I really appreciate your support. Wouldn't have missed it, she said with a smile. I saw all of your social media posts about the grand reopening, I said, giving her a hug. The turnout tonight is in large part because of you. My heart squeezed as I remembered that she was a widow. I couldn't imagine the pain she had gone through and must still be going through. Yet, she got up every day to run her flower shop. And here she was supporting her neighbors. I really admired her. My gaze drifted to a tall, lithe woman with dreadlocks wrapped atop her head in a colorful bandana. Is that who I think it is? Our interpretive dance instructor, Carrie said with a nod and a smile. I invited her. That's perfect, I said, laughing and remembering how I'd hoped to find my thing in her class and all I'd managed to do was fall on the floor. That was also when the lawyer had called me to let me know the Blacks had passed away and left me the diner, changing my life. We'll catch you later, Courtney said to Carrie, Adrian, and Katie, before guiding me by the elbow through the crowd to where Adrian's sister, Martina, and her fiancé, Turner, were bent over the jukebox. Martina's toe tapped the floor with the pointy toe of her heeled shoe. She wore a waist-pinching wool suit and matching fedora with a sharp feather. Turner had his arm draped around her shoulders, while he fidgeted with his ascot. Katie's social media helped get the word out about the grand reopening, and I added some wonderful people to the private guest list as well, Courtney said to me, before leaning toward Martina to say, "Choose the song that's G6. You won't be disappointed." "Thanks, Courtney," she said, glancing up at her. "How's your dog, Atticus?" "He's enjoying his yard and the fence we put up," she said, a mysterious smile appearing on her face, making me decide she was thinking of Curtis and how their fence disagreements had led them to love. "How's your cat, Turner Jr.?" "Great," Martina said. "Although, if we have a boy, then we may need to rethink his name," Turner said with a chuckle. "Marriage first," Martina said, giving him a look. "There are a lot of items on my very long to-do list before the wedding, and the thought of children." "Whatever your list says, then that's what we'll do," Turner joked, making me laugh. The mamas and the papas, dream a little dream of me, started over the brand new stereo system as I waved goodbye to Martina. We barely had time to catch up with them before Courtney hurried me through the crowd again. "This is Abigail and Cooper," Courtney said, introducing me to a cute couple who had brought their dogs with them, each dressed in 50s attire, but making me wonder if that was some kind of a health code violation. "This is Tabitha Smith, the co-owner of the Decadent Diner." "Nice to meet you," I told them, touched that Courtney had invited so many people tonight. "Thank you for coming to our grand reopening." "Nice to meet you too," Abigail said, petting her little dog that was tucked into her bag. "This diner is fantastic." Cooper nodded. "We were discussing the various charity events we could host here at the Decadent Diner. I assume you rent the place out for a fee?" Yes. "I mean, of course," I said, thinking I would need to talk with my partner about renting the diner out. Well, if I could ever find him. I wanted to ask Courtney what Spencer was so busy doing, but before I could say anything else, she whisked me away. "Hannah." "Blake," Courtney called, waving her hand above the crowd. I thought we were about to get a trayful of tomato soup spilled on us as Timmy squeezed by us, but he swept his tray out of the way just in time. Crisis averted. "Good evening, Miss Smith," Timmy said. "Nice recovery on the tray, Timmy," I said, nodding with an expression that let him know I was impressed with his new skills. "And please call me Tabitha." He nodded shyly before delivering the contents of his tray to a nearby table. "Hannah and Blake, this is Tabitha, the co-owner of the Decadent Diner, who I told you about," Courtney said, gesturing to a couple who looked very much in love. "Nice to meet you," I said, shaking hands with each of them. "Love this place," Hannah said, looking excited. "Thank you," I said, feeling proud of this diner. "The 50s theme is fantastic," Blake said, glancing around. "I can't take full credit for that," I said, thinking of the blacks. "The 50s theme was started when dear friends of mine purchased the place after meeting here and falling in love. But I'm happy to keep their restaurant going with a revamp." "This is a wonderful find," Hannah said, lacing her fingers through Blake's. "I'll have to let my women's 9-holer golf group know about this diner. We're always on the lookout for a fantastic place to lunch." "What a great idea," Courtney said, before excusing us and leading me away. I leaned toward Courtney. "I'm sure a lot of people are here because of Katie's social media shout-out and the newspaper article, but you really helped spread the word. Your friends are even talking about hosting lunches and renting out the place. We owe you." Courtney dismissed my debt of gratitude with a wave of her hand. "Nonsense. I'm happy to help. This diner has become my second home." "Mine too," I said, although I needed to start looking for a first home since I'd given up my apartment. The success of the evening felt surreal. I was so thankful to the blacks for gifting me half of their special restaurant, and I loved all of the changes that we'd made. This diner really did feel like home as Courtney introduced me to more guests she'd invited tonight. Her friends Krista and Mason were going to include the restaurant in a travel guide they were writing about Sacramento. Lucy and Jake, Lucy wearing an adorable 50s-style apron, and Jake in an old-timey firefighter uniform, had placed orders with Davis, who was working tonight but currently otherwise occupied in the photo booth with our hostess server, for Curtis's citywide famous cinnamon rolls for a fire department bake sale. And Michelle and Brooks had claimed a booth to come and write each Wednesday morning. Without my realizing it, the restaurant had become a second home to the whole community. I loved that I'd helped create this second home for everyone. But where was my co-owner? Chapter 18. I appreciate you showing me the changes around the diner and introducing me to your friends, Courtney, I said, giving her a bear hug before pulling back and looking her in the eye. Really, thanks for all you've done. But I need to find Spencer now. Come with me, she said, pulling her cell phone out and tapping the keys, before weaving us in and out of the crowd at the grand reopening party, who were here to support the Decadent diner. Here to support Spencer. Here to support me. Here to support us. My emotions were in overdrive. This all felt unbelievable. Hang on one more minute, Tabitha. There's a spot open that I haven't shown you yet. Ah yes, Courtney said. The next thing I knew, we had arrived at the booth, that special booth I had read about in the newspaper's feature. The booth where Spencer's grandparents had met. The booth where their love story had started. My bottom lip jutted out a little, and I started to get emotional when I saw that it had been left in the original condition, completely unchanged. In the center of the battered, carved-on tabletop sat a little white card with black cursive letters stating, "Reserved." What the? How lucky that there's an empty booth here, Courtney said, sounding way too innocent as the corner of her mouth tipped up and she plucked away the little note card. With the restaurant so busy, this must be a sign. A good sign or a bad sign? I asked, my voice tight with sudden panic. Wait, I needed to be done believing in signs. It was time to make my own happiness. Give it up, Courtney. That little card says this table is reserved. What's going on? Just trust me and take a seat, my friend, she said, gesturing for me to sit down and then craning her neck behind her. Relax and unwind after such a big night. I'll get you a milkshake. Where is good service when you need it? I don't need anything, I said, except that wasn't true. I needed Spencer. I needed to apologize for leaving and to thank him for finishing all of the remodeling we'd originally planned. More than anything, I needed to find out if he meant what he said about waiting for me. I'll put your order in right away, Courtney said, and then hurried off with a last wink at me over her shoulder. Frazzled from the whirlwind tour, the introductions, the potential new business prospects, and not knowing where I stood with Spencer, I had to admit it was nice to have a moment to catch my breath alone at this table in the bustling restaurant. Inhaling slowly did nothing to calm my nerves, unfortunately. Maybe Courtney was right that a milkshake would help. It would remind me of simpler times when life had seemed easy. My gaze dropped to where the note card had been on the tabletop, and I saw the familiar initials IF plus LB carved there. Ida Fields and Lester Black. This was where Spencer's grandparents' lifetime romance had started. So sweet. My heart ached with wanting the same thing with Spencer, but one of us always seemed to be leaving. All of a sudden, the chatter around the restaurant ended. I lifted my head just as a click came from the speakers, followed by a moment of complete silence in the diner, and then the first notes of In the Still of the Night by the Five Satins belted out in smooth pulsing beats. Prickly needles danced across my chest as a wave of nostalgia washed over me. Mr. and Mrs. Black's song. The same song Spencer and I had danced to in this very diner. His grandparents really had the perfect relationship. They never would have messed things up the way Spencer and I had. They made love seem easy, just dancing around their house, enjoying their time together. I fingered their initials carved into the table that were smooth and deep. My eyebrows came together. There were new letters carved beside them that weren't there before. May I join you? Came a familiar deep male voice. Tingles skittered up my arms as I recognized Spencer's voice and the same words his grandfather had first said to his grandmother all those years ago. I didn't have to ask to know Spencer had said those exact words on purpose. My throat tightened as I lifted my head, remembering his grandma's response. You bet, handsome, I said. Spencer grinned and slipped into the booth across from me, as if no time had passed since we last saw each other. His dark hair was greased back, and he wore his grandfather's black leather jacket over a white t-shirt. He looked sexy, so unbelievably sexy. Our gazes locked, and butterflies danced in my belly. It's good to see you, he said, studying my face as if he wanted to memorize it. Really good to see you. You too, I said, thinking how much I'd missed just being near him. I looked for you earlier when I first arrived. I wanted to find you, but Courtney kept introducing me around. He chuckled a little. That's my fault. I needed to take care of a few things, so I asked her to distract you and then bring you to our table. Our table. My belly did a little flip. I raised an eyebrow. Were you the one she kept texting on her cell phone? Guilty as charged, he said with a shrug. How are you? Contrite. Nervous. Excited. I'm okay. He nodded. I'm glad you made it back for the reopening. You did an amazing job finishing the remodel, I said, shifting in my seat and feeling nervous, as if I were a young girl on a first date with the boy I loved and I wanted to know if he felt the same way. The diner looks even better than I imagined. A new look for the next chapter in our lives, he said, glancing up at the framed photo of his grandparents that hung on the wall beside the framed photo of his parents. This book ends in the same way, though. Or at least, I hope it will. I hope so too, I said, my heart squeezing as hope lit up inside my chest. I've been wanting to talk to you. To tell you. I shouldn't have just left like that, without talking to you first. An email saying I'm moving isn't exactly professional for a co-owner. Strong emotions flickered across his handsome face. I'm not going to lie. It hurt when you left. It about killed me when you cut me off. I'm sorry, I said, tears burning the backs of my eyes. Not because you're a co-owner of the diner, he said, giving me a side glance. It hurt because I thought we wanted to be together. I did want that, I said, my voice desperate as I spread my palms on the table. But in the back of my mind, I kept worrying you'd leave again. A muscle on his temple twitched, and I knew he was upset but holding back what he wanted to say. I knew him inside and out, which is what happens when you grow up together. He never could control his emotions. I knew I was about to receive the reprimand I probably deserved. I braced myself, ready to take any painful words he dealt. It's my fault you left, he said, stunning me to my very core. He reached over and traced the back of my hand, sending tingles skittering across my skin. I'm the one who gave you reasons to think I might leave you. I'm sorry for hurting you, Tabs. I sat there stunned, realizing how much he had changed. He was not the young guy who reacted off his emotions. He was a man now. A thoughtful man who took responsibility for his actions, and who cared about how I felt. I know you're sorry, I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. You already apologized, but I appreciate you doing it again. I want you to know I mean it, he said firmly. Thank you, I said, glancing at the table before looking across at him again. I read the newspaper article about the reopening and the conversation you had with the columnist. Is it true that you're still waiting for me? He looked me directly in the eyes. I will never leave you again. If I have to spend the rest of my life proving that to you, then that's what I'll do. I gulped. The rest of your life? Whatever it takes for you to trust me again. I wanted to surprise you with the remodel and the newspaper article, he said, closing his hand around mine before meeting my gaze again. Your sister said I should have made you feel secure, instead of trying to surprise you. She was right. I let out an incredulous laugh, unable to believe he was taking the blame for everything when I knew I'd made mistakes too. You know, I thought that man from the newspaper you came in with that day was a real estate agent you were using to sell the diner. His eyes widened. You thought that? Tabs, no? I shook my head. You had said many times that you wanted to sell the diner. I didn't know you had changed your mind for sure, and it felt like all of my fears were coming true. I'd never have the job I loved or the man I loved. His mouth fell open a little. Did you just say what I think you said? My eyes bulged because it had just slipped out. Then I took a big, bracing breath, deciding to be brave. I love you, Spencer. I've been holding back my feelings, which I'm sure didn't make you feel secure either. I love you, Tabs, he said, his green eyes turning misty as he reached across the table with his other hand, clasping both of my hands with his. Always have and always will. I lifted my lashes. I'm sorry I left, Spencer. Me too. For so much, he said. I blinked back the tears, wondering where we went from here. We both left, I said, raising one of my shoulders. Does that make us even? He squeezed my hands and leaned toward me. More importantly, we both came back. Good point, I said, feeling something crinkle in my hand. What's this? Something for you to read, he said, releasing my hands and leaning back. Open it. My throat constricted. So many emotions ran through me. I had admitted to Spencer that I loved him. He said he loved me too. He didn't have a real estate agent, and the diner wasn't being sold. What else was there to talk about? What could this letter be? I opened my hand to find a small cream-colored envelope that wasn't sealed. On the outside of the envelope was Spencer's name, written in cursive handwriting that looked familiar. My forehead wrinkled until it clicked. I'd seen that same long, skinny handwriting on the chalkboard in his grandparents' kitchen, on recipe cards, birthday cards, and so much more. This was Mrs. Black's handwriting. Why would Spencer want me to read a letter to him from his grandma? Are you sure you want me to read this? I said, knowing he was opening up his full heart to me right now. He nodded. I'm sure. Inhaling deeply, I turned the envelope over, pulled out the letter, and unfolded it. The cursive handwriting filled the entire page, and I glanced at the bottom line, confirming the letter was from his grandma. Chills ran up my spine as I took another deep breath and read. Dearest Spencer, if you're reading this letter, that means 3 months have passed since your grandpa and I made our way to heaven, and Frank Fields has delivered this package to you. I'm sure our passing brought up feelings from losing your parents. For that, I'm sorry. Please remember that the 4 of us are together now, watching over you, and never too far away. As you know, we decided to leave half of the diner to you. I know you have your own career, but we thought it would do you some good to come back to your roots for a time. As for the other half of the diner, you know we left it to Tabitha, who always felt like a granddaughter to us. We hope you have enjoyed co-owning the diner together, but now that the 3 months are up, if you'd prefer to sell it, then that's okay too. The diner was special to us for many reasons. Mostly because we purchased it together at a time we needed a fresh start. We never told you this, but your grandpa and I broke up for a time. He'd been away at college while I was home taking care of my sick mom. There were a lot of frustrations running through me, and well, I ended things thinking it would make the pain of missing him go away. Turns out, the heart doesn't heal when it withdraws from love. Quite the opposite, in fact, which you've probably learned yourself firsthand. Love is a precious thing, and I was lucky he gave me a second chance. So we came back to where it all started. Working at the diner, saving up, and then purchasing the diner eventually. A second chance can be the most beautiful thing in the world. It lets us know that we're human and we make mistakes. but the heart can forgive and release that pain. Sometimes it can even turn a heartbreak around and into a beautiful love that lasts a lifetime. Only you know what the future holds for you. The box in this package is for you when you make that choice. Create the best life you can and take care of yourself, sweet boy. All my love. Grandma. My vision blurred, multiple tears spilling down my cheeks and landing on the paper. I gasped, horrified that my tears had smudged some of the words in this precious letter. As I wiped at the drops, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a figure move below me on the floor. Slowly, I turned to see the white and black saddle shoe on the checkered floor. My gaze moved up past the bent denim-covered knee, and up further to the black leather jacket over the white t-shirt, until my gaze locked with sparkling green eyes. Spencer was down on one knee. The song ended over the loudspeakers, the chatter stopped, and time stood still as I stared at my first and only love. "What are you doing?" I blurted. "I'm making my choice," he said, his green eyes dancing. "Tabitha Smith, you are stubborn and bullheaded when it comes to your opinions, passionate when it comes to something you want, and giving and kind when it comes to your heart. I love everything about you. Spencer." "We met when we were young and I was just a boy," he said, his tone confident and firm. "I've learned from my mistakes. More than anything, I want to spend the rest of my life with you, running this diner for as long as you want. Will you marry me?" He opened a small white velvet box that looked old and like it had seen better days. Inside sat his grandma's diamond engagement ring, with its ornate detailing surrounding a round diamond. I closed my eyes and could see it on Mrs. Black's left ring finger, as she rested her palm on Mr. Black's shoulder, and they danced around the kitchen to 50s music, looking lovingly into each other's eyes with smiles on their faces. I opened my eyes and found the entire diner watching us. Spencer was down on one knee. I was gripping the smudged letter in my right hand and covering my heart with my left hand. My gaze drifted to the table where we had just been sitting. Was this really happening? I blinked once, twice, 3 times. My head was still spinning, and I didn't know if this was real or just a dream. While I was deciding if I needed to pinch myself, I noticed something written next to the carved letters, if plus LB. New carving spelling out, SB plus TS equals forever. My left hand flew to my mouth, and a small gasp escaped as I turned back to Spencer. "Did you carve our initials into the table?" "Yes, I did," he said, his voice calm and sure. I lowered my hand. "Did you just ask me to marry you?" "Correct again," he said. I tilted my head. "Would you mind pinching me?" "I'm asking you to marry me, Tabs." "I'm not going to pinch you." "You have to pinch me," I said in a desperate tone as we started arguing, as always. "I'm not sure if I'm awake or not, and it's the only way to know if I'm dreaming or awake." Spencer looked like I'd backed him into a corner. "I can't pinch you. That will hurt you and—" "I'll do it," Carrie said, coming out of nowhere and stepping forward. She clamped her fingers over my mint green polka dot covered forearm and gave my skin a firm squeeze. "Ouch." "You're welcome," she said, stepping back and standing beside Courtney, Curtis, Katie, Timmy, and Davis. "Now put the man out of his misery and give him an answer." "An answer?" "Right," I said, feeling breathless. "What was the question?" Instead of being upset or running away, Spencer chuckled. "Will you marry me, Tabs?" Now that I knew I was awake, I didn't have to think about my answer. "Yes, yes, and yes," I said, my heart beating a mile a minute. The corners of Spencer's mouth curved upward as he lifted my left hand and slid the ring onto my 4th finger. Then he stood and pulled me into his arms. "I love you so much," he said, his smile warming me from the top of my head all the way down to my toes. Then he leaned forward and kissed me, his mouth capturing mine as if to seal the deal. The kiss made me woozy, or maybe that was from all of the surreal emotions rolling through me, so I pulled back and took a seat in the booth before I passed out. "We're engaged," I said, glancing down at the sparkling antique ring on my finger that already held so much sentimental value. "We're engaged," Spencer said, seeming amused at my reaction. Suddenly, Tina bullied her way through the crowd. Now that she was out of the photo booth, I could see that she hadn't changed much about how she normally dressed or how she did her makeup, but somehow she fit in perfectly with the 50s-themed costumes. She wore her usual scowl as she slammed a milkshake onto the table, complete with whipped cream, cherries, and 2 straws. I had missed her. "Are you here to take our order?" I asked. "Me?" she grumbled. "Why would I do that?" I glanced at Spencer, who grinned. When I looked back up at Tina, she held a Polaroid camera in her hands and leaned her eye toward the viewfinder. "Say cheese," she said in a bored, monotone voice. I shook my head. "I have a better idea." I leaned across the table, and Spencer met me halfway. When our lips came together, I kissed him with all of the love inside me. My entire body tingled with the possibilities for our future, and the flash from the camera went off behind my closed eyelids like fireworks. After a long, sweet kiss, we both pulled back and smiled at each other. Spencer caressed my cheek. "There's no turning back now," he said. "I don't want to turn back. I'm here for keeps. You plus me equals forever. The table says so, and that table is never wrong." "Finally, we agree on something," he said, taking the Polaroid photo of the 2 of us from Tina and standing up from the booth. Giving me a sexy grin that made my tummy do a somersault, he tucked the photo of our kiss into the frame hanging next to his parents' photo, and then he stepped back. The diner erupted in applause, as if this new addition was the finishing touch of the remodel. My chest filled with warmth as I stood up and smiled back at all of our friends, new and old. Spencer cupped my face in his hands and kissed me again. All the joy that a second chance could bring radiated through me, pure and perfect in that kiss. Then he encircled me in his arms, and we stared at his grandparents' first kiss, the sweet moment that had started it all. The end. Note from the author. Now that you've met Katie Ellis from Gold Rush Flowers, spend more time with her in the Wedding Whisperer series, and then later in the Mistletoe Book Club series. Katie's love story was bittersweet, and she just may need a second chance at love as well. Happy reading! Susan.